On the afternoon of May the 25th of 2021 in Prentiss, Mississippi, a 49-year-old black man, Eric Lachey Boykin of Gulfport, was arrested and charged with armed robbery and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. The hunt for Boykin involved several law enforcement agencies. Officers located Boykin in the woods about 600 yards from the bank he had allegedly held up. There were 4 white officers with dogs who posed for a photograph while surrounding Boykin, who had posed, smiling. When the picture emerged, the police force came under fire and was labeled as inhumane. A Twitter user criticized the officers and said that they had made the ordeal look like they are posing with a lion or deer they shot. Josie Duffy Rice, a U.S. criminal justice system reporter, tweeted that none of the people involved realize what a bad look this is, or they do know how it looks, and that's why they posted it. She described the action as very, very bad, regardless of the reason behind it. One person commented on Wright's tweets and said that the photo showed the need for police reform. According to WDAM, WLBT had questioned agencies about who the officers were and if it was routine procedure to take pictures in such a manner at the end of an arrest. Richard Browning, a Prentiss police investigator, confirmed to the Daily Mail that the officers were not part of his department. Number 7. Shane Lee Brown. At 4:44 p.m. on January the 8th of 2020, 23-year-old Shane Lee Brown was pulled over by police officers in Henderson, Nevada for a headlight violation. After the 23-year-old provided his name and social security card, the officers looked up his record and identified him as Shane Neal Brown, a man who had been wanted for illegal possession of a firearm. Shane Lee told the officers, "I've never been arrested for weapons charges," and pleaded with police to double-check his identity. He was arrested and remained in custody at the Henderson Detention Center for 2 days. He was then transferred to the Clark County Detention Center and jailed for another 4 days, despite repeatedly telling officials he was not the Shane Brown they were looking for, according to a National Public Radio report. On January the 14th of 2020, a public defender told Judge Joe Hardy during a return warrant hearing that the wrong Shane Brown was incarcerated. There was a disparity in middle names, heights, ages, and races, as shown by records. Shane Lee Brown was a 23-year-old black man and 5 feet 7 inches tall, while Shane Neal Brown was a 49-year-old white man who stood at 5 foot 11 inches tall. Fox 13 reported. The wrongfully confined 23-year-old then filed a suit against Las Vegas area law enforcement agencies in January of 2022. CNN reported on July the 8th of 2022 that Shane Lee had won a settlement of $25,000 from the Henderson Police Department and $65,000 from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police. In an interview, Shane Lee described his experience as a simple traffic violation that escalated into more or less a nightmare. Number 6. Kiera Green. On March 27th of 2018, 29-year-old Kiera Green was arrested in San Bernardino County, California, on charges related to the murder of 73-year-old Las Vegas man Gassem Aliascari. Kiera was extradited to Clark County, Nevada, where she remained incarcerated for 72 days. A special public defender subpoenaed more information from Las Vegas Metropolitan Police and discovered details about the true killer, Kiara Jean Green, who had a similar name and age to Kiera Green. According to a homicide lieutenant from the police department, he'd never seen anything like that in his career and said it is an extremely unique situation. On August the 7th of 2018, Kiara Jean was arrested by law enforcement. She confessed to the police department that she'd strangled Aliascari using a shirt, which resulted in him falling and hitting his head on the bathtub. On September the 27th of 2018, the real killer was indicted by a grand jury for the murder. At the time of the proceedings, police officers Fred Merrick and Laura Cody had testified that they had wrongfully arrested Kiera. On April the 28th of 2020, Kiera filed a lawsuit against the police department, alleging that they'd violated her rights. Number 5. Sean Paul Galjaw, version 1. On the early morning of May the 22nd of 2013 in Cutoff, Louisiana, Robert Paul Choest, aged 31, mistook a man for an alligator lying on his grandparents' driveway near his home and shot him dead. The gunman was arrested and charged with second-degree murder of 41-year-old Sean Paul Galjaw. On January the 29th of 2016, Choest was found guilty of second-degree murder and handed down the mandatory life sentence without parole. According to Huma Today, He appealed and said that the evidence at his trial was insufficient to support a guilty verdict because he was intoxicated at the time of the shooting and the state had failed to prove specific intent. At the trial, he testified that he'd been up for 3 days and had crystal methamphetamine, 5 rocks of crack cocaine, about 6 beers and several pain pills in his system before the shooting. When the judge had announced the verdict, he said that the accuracy of the gunshot was proof of intent. The First Circuit Court of Appeals denied Chuest's appeal. Number 4. Annette Fontana, Heather Hendricks, version 2. Midway through testimony in the second-degree murder case against Sean Paul Galjaw on March 21st of 2015 in Louisiana, State District Judge John LeBlanc declared mistrial and said that prosecutors had exercised poor judgment in their dealings with witnesses. 2 days before the mistrial was declared, there had been a hearing in which La Fourche Sheriff's Detective Robert Mason testified. The prosecutors, Annette Fontana and Heather Hendricks, then visited the crime scene together with Mason and the lead investigator of the case, Christian Egan, who at the time hadn't testified yet. According to Hendricks, they'd inspected the property from the road and the detectives provided security throughout the visit. The father of the defendant, whom the defense had planned to call as a witness, saw the prosecutors together with the detectives and began to yell at them. LeBlanc said that the situation was disrespectful to the jurors. He added, "It's about bad decision-making." After the jurors' deliberation, they told the state district judge that they were deadlocked in a 9-3 decision. In the state, at least 10 jurors must agree to convict someone of a charge. An hour later, the jury still hadn't reached a verdict, so LeBlanc declared a mistrial. Eventually, in 2016, Galjaw was put on trial a second time and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that was later also upheld on appeal. Number 3. London Metropolitan Police. In Forest Gate, East London, England, on March 22nd of 2018, the Metropolitan Police was criticized after a selfie of 2 officers at a murder scene had been posted on Twitter. The officers from Forest Gate North's Safer Neighborhoods team posed, put their heads together and pursed their lips for the photo in front of the Stratford Centre where 20-year-old Benjamin Piekney had been stabbed to death the night before. According to Mail Online, Piekney had stepped in to protect his friend during a heated confrontation. At the time, it was the 8th killing in the capital in the past week. One Twitter user remarked upon the misguidedness of taking a selfie by the crime scene, given the recent string of violent incidents, while another criticized the officers by writing that their primary goal should have been finding the perpetrator. The selfie was immediately taken down, after which a spokesman for the police service said, "We accept that the officers showed a lack of judgment and sensitivity in posting a selfie picture tweet from the scene of a serious crime, and we apologize for any offense caused." The officers were reportedly spoken to by their superiors and reminded of how to use social media responsibly. Number 2. Lauren Bonamo and Gabriel Ferris. 23-year-old French students Lauren Bonamo and Gabriel Ferris were discovered dead on the night of June the 29th of 2008. The bodies were found tied up with a combined 244 stab wounds in a rented flat in Stirling Gardens, southeast London. Almost a year later, the killers, 23-year-old Dano Sonex and 33-year-old Nigel Farmer, were found guilty and sentenced to 40 and 35 years respectively. The judge described the incident as one of the truly horrific murders in British criminal history. The Justice Secretary, Jack Straw, told members of Parliament that the killings were a result of the probation system's poor judgment and poor management, as well as the Metropolitan Police and Prison Service's errors. Straw said that he accepted full responsibility for the very serious failures and personally apologized to the families of the deceased. Number 1. Iowa juror. On November the 13th of 2014, the Iowa Court of Appeals ordered a new trial for a man convicted of murder in 32-year-old Buddy Frisbee's death. More than 2 years prior, Tyler Webster, who was 33 at the time, shot his best friend Frisbee twice in the head. Later on, he confessed that he had done so because he believed that his best friend was forcing himself upon 22-year-old Shelby Hall. Hall was Frisbee's girlfriend at the time. She later testified that there wasn't an assault but rather a consensual matter. Webster was then found guilty on the charge of second-degree murder. Later on, the Court of Appeals overturned the conviction since it was tainted by a juror's undisclosed relationship with the Frisbee family. Prosecutors then appealed. According to the Washington Times, employees at the courthouse, where the unnamed female juror worked, told the judge that they were surprised that she'd been selected because of the relationship. It was then discovered that Frisbee's stepsister was a close friend of the juror's daughter. It was later found out that the mother of the victim, Eliza Bustle, had posted on Facebook, "Give me strength," and one of the jurors liked it during the proceedings. Days after the trial, Bustle wrote on Facebook that a first-degree murder conviction had been wanted by the family, to which the juror responded, "I wish you could have gotten murder in the first degree." The court disapproved of the juror's conduct. Ultimately, the justice said that the juror's actions had shown poor judgment but hadn't reached a level of misconduct or bias required to overturn the verdict against the killer. On June the 26th of 2021, an off-duty police officer was knocked out at a wedding reception in Knoxville, Tennessee, for pestering a man with racist comments. While in the parking lot of the wedding venue, 22-year-old Tanner Holt told Jonathan Tony that he didn't know they let black people in the reception hall. Tony, a black man, repeatedly asked the heavily intoxicated Holt to stop talking about race. The white officer refused to do so, insisting he was part of the black community. Tony couldn't take it anymore and punched Holt once, knocking him out. Officers from the Knoxville Police Department arrived at the scene, but no criminal charges were filed against Tony. Holt was taken to a hospital and subsequently recovered. He resigned from the force in October amidst an internal affairs investigation into his conduct and comments at the wedding. No charges were filed against him either. Number 7. Wooford Lomax. On Christmas Day 2008, James Joseph Cialela was in a South Philadelphia movie theater watching a screening of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. 31-year-old Wooford Lomax was also at the Riverview movie theater with his girlfriend and her teenage children. It was reported that they kept talking and laughing during the movie. A man in front of them, not Cialela, told them to quiet down, and Lomax reportedly replied, "We can't laugh?" A brawl ensued between that man and Lomax, during the course of which 29-year-old Cialela intervened and threw popcorn at the latter. He then brandished a Kel-Tec 380 handgun and shot Lomax in the left arm, breaking it. Two versions of events emerged in the aftermath of Cialela's arrest for attempted murder, aggravated assault, and weapons violations. Lomax's testimony depicted him as the main aggressor, but Cialela's defense argued that he was punched and choked as he tried to break up the fight and fired his weapon in self-defense. Cialela had spent 5 months in Iraq with the army before being honorably discharged in September. The attempted murder charge was eventually thrown out, with his lawyer stating, "He's a marksman. If he wanted to shoot to kill, he would have." In November of 2010, Cialela pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and other charges, for which he was sentenced to up to 23 months of house arrest and 5 years of probation. Number 6. Franklin Williams. On July the 31st of 2018, Franklin Williams appeared before Judge John Russo in Cleveland, Ohio, after he'd been convicted in connection to a string of armed robberies. Throughout the 54-minute hearing, 32-year-old Williams interrupted Russo, prosecutors, and his own defense team dozens of times. Courtroom video footage showed the judge repeatedly scolding Williams as he demanded a chance to speak, stating, "You are trying to take my life and you are not letting me tell you what's going on." Russo claimed that the man would have the opportunity to address the court after arguments from his legal representatives were heard. As he continued to interrupt the proceedings, Russo warned him that he would be gagged, but Williams persisted in his outbursts. The judge then ordered the deputies to tape the man's mouth. Williams tried to get up, but 6 deputies forced him back into his seat and placed a strip of red tape over his mouth. The video made national and international headlines, and the move was criticized by several human rights organizations, including the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio, who described it as humiliating. Russo apologized for the decision a week later and recused himself from Williams' final sentencing. Judge Patricia Cosgrove was appointed by the Supreme Court in his stead, and she presided over Williams' sentencing in February of 2019. The defendant made no interruptions, and when he had a chance to address the court, he tried to portray himself as a social justice icon in a 12-minute statement. Williams didn't apologize to his robbery victims. Instead, focusing on the previous incident with Russo, claiming he'd been treated like a dog about to be put to sleep and suffered the ultimate humiliation. Williams was a repeat offender who'd been imprisoned 4 times in the past. His crimes included robbery, kidnapping, leading the police on a high-speed chase, as well as cutting off his ankle monitor and fleeing the state in the midst of his trial in 2017. Cosgrove called Williams a narcissistic individual who blamed others for his own actions and who'd escalated his offending over the course of a decade. In spite of spending time in prison, Russo had previously sentenced Williams to 24 years in prison, but Cosgrove handed him a 33-year sentence. Number 5. Donald Mangan. 53-year-old Kansas man Donald Mangan was arrested by Reno County law enforcement in October of 2018 for cutting a man on the forearm. Police responded to a late-night call at Mangan's home where they found Harlan Bailey on the floor with a laceration. 53-year-old Bailey told officers that Mangan had cut him because he wouldn't stop talking while he was trying to watch TV. The laceration was deep enough that the victim needed multiple stitches. Mangan was taken into custody for aggravated battery and subsequently appeared via video link from Reno County Jail. Magistrate Judge Cheryl Allen presented the details of the case to Mangan, highlighting that he'd threatened to stab Bailey if he continued to speak. Mangan replied, "That's right," during the proceedings, and he remained jailed on a $25,000 bond. Number 4. Lakeisha Beard. Oregon woman Lakeisha Beard was arrested for disorderly conduct in the spring of 2011 for loudly talking on her cell phone while on a train from Oakland, California to Salem, Oregon. Passengers reported that 39-year-old Beard was on the phone for an estimated 16 hours and had become aggressive when she was confronted and asked to be quiet. She was involved in a verbal altercation with others on the train before resuming the loud conversation, in spite of operators asking riders not to use their cell phones. Amtrak staff called the police following repeated passenger complaints. Operators halted the train about 2 miles from Salem, resulting in a 20-minute delay while Beard was taken into custody. The Tigard resident later told Portland's KATU News that she'd felt disrespected in the incident. Number 3. Christopher Charles Lightsey. In 1995, Christopher Charles Lightsey was on trial in California for the murder of his neighbor, cancer patient William George Compton. By then, Lightsey already had amassed a criminal record that included convictions for drugs and inappropriate contact with minors. He was also considered a suspect in the 1990 unsolved murder of Jessica Martinez, but wasn't charged. In 1993, he attacked 76-year-old Compton, who was his neighbor on Holtby Road in Bakersfield. Lightsey fatally stabbed him 42 times and stole his gun collection, as well as a jar of coins and other items. He was ultimately tracked down, arrested and charged after one of Compton's rifles ended up at a pawn shop. On August 15th of 1995, Lightsey had a series of courtroom outbursts that involved yelling out obscenities and making obscene gestures at the prosecution. The judge had threatened to remove Lightsey from the courtroom, but ultimately decided to have him gagged with duct tape and a wad of gauze. A photo from the proceedings would show the restrained man maintaining up his disruptive behavior and showing the middle finger. Lightsey's outbursts possibly stemmed from mental health issues, as evaluators had deemed he had a narcissistic personality disorder and bipolar disorder, manic type. There was, however, speculation that his behavior in court was his attempt at being declared insane. Lightsey was ultimately deemed competent to stand trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Number 2. Kashonte Short. On September the 10th of 2020, Michigan woman Kashonte Short filed a lawsuit against a man named Richard Jordan for standing her up on a date. Short argued that he'd intentionally caused her emotional distress because the date coincided with her late mother's birthday. They both appeared in Flint court via Zoom in the summer of 2022, and the video subsequently went viral mainly due to Short's interaction with Judge Herman Marable Jr. He initially told the woman that she'd filed the suit in district court when she should have opted for circuit court. Jordan didn't do much talking during the hearing. When asked by the judge if he'd be defending himself, the man said that he thought the suit in which Short demanded $10,000 was a waste of time, given that he'd only been on one bad date with her. Short then accused Jordan of perjury, claiming that she had the documents to prove it. Marable replied that she couldn't make that determination before asking her if she knew what perjury meant. An argument ensued during which Short repeatedly claimed that the judge was insulting her intelligence. Marable tried to explain why perjury didn't apply to the circumstances, but the conversation devolved into a shouting match. Short grew increasingly frustrated, screaming at the judge, repeatedly asking if they were done and refusing to answer his questions. At one point, Marable ripped off his face shield and demanded that the woman stop talking over him. A second bout of shouting erupted after Short seemingly failed to grasp that she'd have to cover Jordan's fees for filing the suit in the wrong court. The judge ultimately muted the Zoom call and transferred the suit to circuit court, but its chances of success were limited, given Short's behavior and her history of initiating lawsuits deemed frivolous. In 2020, she'd sued the Flint Police Department for $300 million and also filed a suit against AT&T, both of which were dismissed. Number 1. Esmeralda Upton. In August of 2022, a Texas realtor was arrested after she was captured on video verbally abusing a group of Indian women. The encounter occurred outside the 60 Vines wine bar in Plano, and its main aggressor was identified as 58-year-old Esmeralda Upton. Indrani Banerjee, Bidisha Rudra, and their friends were in the parking lot when Upton approached them and launched a racist tirade. Among a multitude of slurs, Upton said, "I hate these Indians, and if things are so great in your country, then stay there." She lunged at the women twice and tried to grab their phones upon realizing that they were filming her. When one of the women called the police, Upton reached into her purse and reportedly threatened to shoot them. Fortunately, the situation didn't result in further violence as officers from the Plano Police Department arrived at the scene and separated them. When asked why she'd attacked the women, Upton reportedly told law enforcement that it was because they'd been filming her, adding, "That's what they do, just like black people." She claimed to be Native American and Mexican American, while also mentioning that she lived in a $1.5 million house. Upton was jailed on a $10,000 bond on charges of assault and making threats. Banerjee reported that she'd been a resident of the Dallas area for 29 years, but had never felt so humiliated, threatened, and scared. As of October 2022, she and Rudra had sued Upton for causing them emotional distress. A heated argument erupted outside the Community Health Center in Syracuse, New York, on June the 10th of 2020. According to police records, 44-year-old Chanel Price Green, a mother of 12, was among a group of people waiting outside the center, which was offering free COVID-19 testing. Price Green was asked to stand 6 feet away from the check-in desk, but in the process of maintaining social distance, she allegedly got too close to a pregnant woman in line, who was later identified as Fantasia Turan, aged 26. The two exchanged some choice words, and as tensions escalated, Turan called her boyfriend, 47-year-old Julius Brown, who arrived at the scene after about 10 minutes. Although what exactly transpired next wasn't made clear in initial reports, Price Green eventually needed to be transported to Upstate University Hospital with a midsection stab wound. The victim ultimately passed away from her injuries, and after a preliminary police investigation, both Turan and Brown were arrested on charges of second-degree murder and criminal possession of a weapon. Prior to the start of the trial in late 2022, Turan was offered a plea deal which would have led to her spending 5 years behind bars for Price Green's killing. The offer was declined, and following court proceedings in December, Turan was formally convicted of murder. She was consequently sentenced to 25 years in prison, the same punishment handed down to her partner. Number 7. Abigail Simon. In the spring of 2013, it emerged that a female tutor at Grand Rapids Central and West Catholic High School in Michigan had been having an inappropriate relationship with a teenage student. 35-year-old Abigail Simon was found to have exchanged over 1,000 text messages with the boy, many of them explicit in nature, and was also accused of having intimate relations with him. She was consequently arrested but was offered a plea deal that would have brought a swift end to the criminal proceedings. Simon refused the offer, indicating she wanted to clear her name at trial. Following a probable cause hearing in August of 2013, the woman was offered yet another chance to receive a lighter sentence in exchange for pleading guilty to her charges, but turned it down. Then, at the culmination of the resulting 3-week trial, Simon was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree criminal conduct and 1 misdemeanor count of accosting a minor for immoral purposes. In January of 2015, she was sentenced to between 8 and 25 years behind bars. The judge decreed that Simon would need to undergo lifelong supervision and register as an offender after her eventual release. Under the terms of the plea bargain that Simon rejected, she would have only served a maximum of 2 years in prison. Number 6. Richard Big O Barnett. During the attack on the U.S. Capitol building on January the 6th of 2021, some of the besiegers made their way into the offices of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. A stun gun-wielding man, later identified as 61-year-old Richard Big O Barnett from Gravette, Arkansas, was photographed with his feet up on the polarizing politician's desk. The man reportedly left a profane handwritten note before making off with one of Pelosi's personalized envelopes. The picture swiftly made the rounds on social media, leading to Barnett, a window salesman and former firefighter, becoming one of the more recognizable faces from the infamous riot. With increased notoriety also came heightened attention from law enforcement, as Barnett was reportedly hit with several criminal charges in the insurrection's aftermath, including entering a restricted building with a dangerous weapon. Among the rest of his alleged offenses were counts of theft of government property, disorderly conduct, and obstruction of an official proceeding. In a pretrial hearing, Barnett's representation announced that he would be rejecting the prosecution's plea bargain, which contained sentencing guidelines of between 70 and 87 months behind bars. The defense team called the offer unreasonable, citing Barnett's previously clean record. The matter was therefore taken to trial in September of 2022. Following 8 days of rigorous proceedings in federal court, Barnett was found guilty of 8 criminal counts, facing a maximum penalty of 47 years in prison. Barnett's official sentencing was slated for May of 2023. Number 5. Lakeith Smith. In February of 2015, a group of 5 juveniles from Elmore County, Alabama, carried out a pair of armed home invasions in Millbrook in broad daylight. When police officers were dispatched to the second home, the burglary was still in progress, and they were met with gunfire from some of the teens. Law enforcement returned fire, leading to the death of Adonte Washington, who'd ran through the gate of a wooden privacy fence and rushed towards one of the officers. In body cam footage shown during the resulting criminal trial, it was revealed that Washington had been armed with a .38 caliber revolver when he charged the policeman. In the gunfight's aftermath, legal responsibility for Washington's death fell upon Lakeith Smith, the youngest of the group, who was only 15 years old when he took part in the deadly break-in. Smith was charged with murder under Alabama's accomplice laws. He was reportedly offered a plea bargain which would have sentenced him to 25 years in prison for his friend's death. However, Smith rejected the deal, choosing instead to take his case to trial and fight to prove his innocence. The teen's legal strategy ultimately proved unsuccessful, and a jury found him guilty of felony murder, burglary, and theft. Judge Sibley Reynolds of Alabama's 19th Judicial Circuit Court subsequently sentenced him to 30 years for murder, 15 years for burglary, and 10 years each for 2 theft convictions. The 65-year aggregate total exceeded the prison term offered in the rejected plea deal by 4 decades. Activists set up a Change.org campaign advocating for the young man's early release. As of March of 2023, more than 850,000 people had signed the online petition. Number 4. Ryan Hole. In the early hours of March the 10th of 2003, Florida man Ryan Hole lent his car to his friend and housemate William Allen Jr. after a night of partying. Hole relinquished the vehicle despite the fact that Allen and others had detailed plans to drive to the home of Christine Snyder, steal drugs and money, and then beat up Snyder's teenage daughter. Upon securing the car, Allen reportedly dropped 3 men off at Snyder's house. The trio subsequently broke in and removed a safe containing a pound of marijuana and $425 in cash. During the course of the home invasion, one of the men bludgeoned 18-year-old Jessica Snyder to death with a shotgun. Although Hole was a mile and a half away at the time of the deadly break-in, he nevertheless faced legal repercussions in the aftermath. Under the felony murder rule, prosecutors are able to broaden murder liability for participants in violent felonies to include a killing by an accomplice. Hole was described as an accomplice given that the murder had been facilitated in part by him willingly allowing the perpetrators to utilize his vehicle. Of the 5 defendants allegedly involved, Hole was the only one offered a plea deal, which would have resulted in a prison sentence of 10 years. The man rejected the offer, and after being found guilty of murder at trial, was sentenced to life without parole. In 2015, Hole's prison term was reduced to 25 years by then Florida Governor Rick Scott. Number 3. Reginald Jones. On September the 12th of 2016, New Orleans police were called to the scene of a dispute between neighbors in the 2500 block of Elder Street. According to official documents, Reginald Jones, a man in his early 50s, had brandished a firearm during an argument with his 63-year-old neighbor. The latter told officers that Jones followed him into his yard and threatened him with the gun, which was corroborated by footage taken from his home security cameras. Jones, meanwhile, claimed that the weapon was just a water gun, which he'd allegedly broken into pieces that he then discarded in the Peoples Avenue Canal. Authorities didn't believe him, and he was taken into custody on charges of aggravated assault with a firearm, illegal possession of a firearm by a felon, and obstruction of justice. In November of 2017, Jones agreed to a deal with the state, which had him plead guilty to aggravated assault in exchange for a 5-year prison sentence. Over the next 2 months, however, the man made vociferous attempts to withdraw his plea by appealing to the Louisiana Supreme Court. He also reportedly filed a motion in Orleans Parish Criminal District Court to nullify the plea bargain due to abandonment of counsel and ineffectiveness of legal representation by Orleans Parish public defenders. After securing a new attorney, Jones officially withdrew his plea and the case was brought to the courtroom. After being found guilty during a trial that lasted only 1 day, the man was offered yet another deal which would have seen him serve 15 years behind bars. Jones said no once again, and in the summer of 2018, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Number 2. Anna Sorokin. Notorious Russian fraudster Anna Sorokin was offered a plea deal following her arrest in 2017, but she turned it down, instead opting to take her case to trial. Sorokin exploded on the New York City scene in 2013 when she conceived of a private members club, an arts foundation that would cater to notable artists, including ones she'd met while interning for the French fashion magazine Purple. To make herself more appealing to society's upper crust, the woman falsely claimed to be a German heiress with many millions of dollars to her name, a deception she maintained by forging financial documents and checks. It's been estimated that Sorokin built various people, banks, hotels, and major financial institutions out of a total of $275,000 before her scheme was finally uncovered. Investigators relied on the cooperation of Sorokin's former friend, Rachel DeLoach Williams, who'd lost over $60,000 as a consequence of the extensive fraud. Williams aided the NYPD in a sting operation that ultimately landed Sorokin in handcuffs on charges of attempted grand larceny, second-degree larceny, and theft of services. In December of 2018, the con artist was offered a deal by the prosecution, the terms of which stipulated that she would serve between 3 and 9 years behind bars for her crimes. Sorokin rejected the bargain and then was convicted of her charges during the criminal trial that took place the following March. she was sentenced to a prison term of 4 to 12 years, a slightly elevated punishment in comparison to the deal she was offered. Sorokin still ended up earning supervised release 2 years later, but was then taken back into custody by immigration officials for overstaying her visa. In October of 2022, Sorokin was released again after securing a $10,000 bail bond, but was ordered to remain on 24-hour house arrest with no access to social media. Number 1. Raymond Lindsay Jr. Houston police officers were dispatched to an apartment complex in southeast Montgomery County for a possible domestic disturbance on January the 5th of 2015. Upon arrival, law enforcement encountered Raymond Lindsay Jr. and his girlfriend, who appeared to be fearful of him. As the woman gathered her things to leave the apartment, Lindsay allegedly pointed his finger at the responding officers one by one and threatened to kill them individually. The man then flew into a destructive rage, smashing various items around the house, including a glass table, a television set, and a cage containing a live bird. At that point, backup officers arrived at the scene to assist in taking Lindsay into custody. As they did so, however, the man proceeded to attack them, slamming the apartment door on one of the officers' arms repeatedly before finally being subdued. In the late summer of the following year, after Lindsay had already been held behind bars for 19 months, he was offered a plea deal that would see him released with time served. Although Lindsay indicated he was appreciative of the prosecution's offer, he declined it, as he reportedly did not want to plead guilty. He also expressed his belief that everyone was conspiring against him. Although Lindsay had a documented history of mental illness, he was deemed competent to stand trial following a mental health evaluation. He was ultimately convicted of assault on a public servant and retaliation, for which he received a prison sentence of 40 years. His punishment had been worsened because of his lengthy criminal record, which included prior convictions for burglary, unlawful possession of a vehicle, domestic assault, and family violence. 30-year-old nurse Bridget Freitas was knocked unconscious while attempting to resist arrest at a University of Miami football game on November the 4th of 2017. The 14-second video footage of the incident showed Freitas angrily confronting police officers before she was punched in the face, rendering her unconscious. The video was recorded by witness Eric Argueta, who said Freitas seemed to have no control over herself. She'd allegedly attempted to attack another fan and refused to leave the premises. Police carried her out of Hard Rock Stadium and took her into custody on charges of disorderly conduct and battery on a law enforcement officer. It wasn't Freitas' first run-in with the law, as back in 2012 she was reportedly charged with battery. Number 10. Yom D. Castro, Nelson Jimenez, and Brandy Isom. 31-year-old Nelson Jimenez assaulted an officer on camera while New York police attempted to arrest the criminal on April the 7th of 2020. A second civilian, Brandy Isom, also attacked an officer of the law after being ordered to leave the area. For reasons unknown, Jimenez interrupted the arrest of 27-year-old Yom D. Castro, who was accused of robbery, and punched one of the officers in the face before attempting to flee the scene. Even after the police caught up to him, Jimenez refused to surrender himself peacefully, kicking the same officer repeatedly in the groin and thigh. He continued to resist as he was being handcuffed and removed from the scene. In the aftermath, he was charged with assault, disorderly conduct, harassment, and obstructing government administration. 25-year-old Isom also disregarded police commands to abandon the area due to the ongoing investigation. She, at one point, punched an officer and was therefore arrested on charges of assault and obstruction of governmental administration. Castro, the individual the police had originally been after, was eventually caught and charged with robbery, larceny, and menacing, as well as possession of stolen property. Number 9. Eleanor Stern. 31-year-old Eleanor Stern was caught on camera assaulting a Florida Highway Patrol trooper on December the 10th of 2015 after getting in a heated argument with a Department of Motor Vehicles employee. The Boca Raton resident became enraged after she was informed she'd brought the wrong paperwork to her appointment at the DMV. She angrily confronted the desk clerk and was eventually told to leave, but refused. A state trooper subsequently approached Stern, who then turned violent. An eyewitness who recorded the entire incident uploaded the video to Facebook. Stern could be seen kicking the police officer several times, prompting the trooper to bring her to the ground. The woman continued to struggle on the floor but was eventually wrangled into custody and charged with resisting arrest. Number 8. Tara Trunfio. A 23-year-old woman from Colorado was arrested for defying mandatory quarantine during a trip to Hawaii on May the 16th of 2020. Tara Trunfio had signed a document agreeing to spend 14 days in quarantine upon her arrival in Hawaii, a prerequisite to visiting the islands during the initial stages of the pandemic. Trunfio posted several pictures of herself at different beaches across Maui, openly flouting her signed agreement to stay indoors for 2 weeks. After her initial arrest for failing to comply with mandatory quarantine, the young woman ran into further legal troubles. First, on September the 11th, for stabbing a homeless woman she'd invited to sleep on her couch, then for destroying the windows of several houses and eventually breaking into one of them a month later. During this period of criminal activity, she was charged with resisting arrest, second-degree assault, unauthorized entry into a dwelling, criminal property damage, and disorderly conduct. Number 7. Timothy O'Donnell. During a riot in the streets of Chicago on May the 30th of 2020, Timothy O'Donnell, donning a Joker mask, was arrested for setting a police car ablaze. 31-year-old O'Donnell's defense attorney, Michael Leonard, argued his client just happened to be near the patrol car at the same moment a different rioter set it on fire. Leonard called his client a pacifist, but the suspect's criminal history contradicted his statements. O'Donnell had reportedly failed to appear in court for hearings in 5 different states in connection to 9 different incidents. The prosecution presented evidence proving O'Donnell had ignited the vehicle's gas tank before remaining in the area for another 15 minutes as he rolled a cigarette. Several witnesses provided authorities with recordings and photographs of the crime scene. One of the pictures showed a man in a Joker mask posing in front of the patrol car with a distinctive neck tattoo visible, which matched one sported by O'Donnell. Though he initially denied each of the charges against him, he eventually pleaded guilty to interfering with law enforcement and on June the 22nd of 2022 was sentenced to 34 months in prison. Number 6. Michael and Alexandra Nelson. During a routine traffic stop in Hempstead, New York, on December the 23rd of 2018, 38-year-old Michael Nelson and his 29-year-old wife, Alexandra, head-butted and threw shoes and underwear at police officers. After the couple had been pulled over, officers realized Nelson was visibly intoxicated and attempted to detain him. He resisted, head-butting the policeman repeatedly, while his wife began throwing her shoes and underwear at the state troopers. The Nelsons were eventually restrained and arrested. Michael was charged with driving under the influence, criminal possession of a controlled substance, harassment, resisting arrest, and second-degree assault. His wife, on the other hand, faced charges of attempted assault and disorderly conduct. Both of them refused to submit to field sobriety tests. Their lawyer, Mark Gann, argued that police reports on the incident were largely exaggerated and there was more to the story than initially revealed. Number 5. Daniel Weber. On January the 5th of 2023, 39-year-old Daniel Weber attacked a police officer outside his child's elementary school in Memphis, Tennessee. The officer had noticed Weber walking toward the building with a hostile demeanor and approached him, to which the irate father reacted violently. Weber had reportedly been denied entrance to the school after he demanded to see his child. He wasn't permitted to do so at the time in question, although the reasons for the restricted visitation weren't made public. Following a brief argument, Weber threatened to harm the officer. When he was subsequently told to leave, he punched the policeman twice. He was finally subdued after police stunned him twice with an electrical weapon. Weber was charged with aggravated assault on a first responder, criminal trespassing, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct following his arrest. Number 4. Tamani Crum. New York police officer Kendo Kinsey was caught on camera punching 19-year-old Tamani Crum in the face, knocking her to the ground after she attempted to prevent authorities from arresting her boyfriend. On August 30th of 2022, The incident took place in Harlem, where 22-year-old Elvin James was being taken into custody on suspicion of attempted murder. Officer Kinsey was recorded striking Crum hard enough to knock her to the ground just outside James's apartment building. Though activists immediately voiced disgust at the policeman, the NYPD defended the officer's actions, indicating James had brandished a gun and that defusing the situation was necessary to avoid further casualties. Both Crum and James were cuffed and taken into custody. As of the latest developments, Kinsey hadn't been disciplined in any form. Activists continued to campaign for action to be taken against Officer Kinsey, who they believed to have used unnecessary force rather than de-escalating the situation. Number 3. Andrew Tornetta. 20-year-old Andrew Tornetta was arrested for allegedly punching a police horse during a Philadelphia Eagles game on January the 21st of 2018. Tornetta, who'd gone to Lincoln Financial Field in Philadelphia before the NFC Championship game between the Vikings and Eagles, was accused of attacking both the horse and an officer during a violent altercation. He was charged with aggravated assault, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and failure to disperse, and subsequently entered an accelerated misdemeanor program, which allowed him to avoid prison time in exchange for completing mandated community service. Tornetta, however, denied the charges and filed a lawsuit against the Eagles, as well as police officers Wesley Van Wyck and Paul Tennenny. He accused them of completely fabricating the incident in order to justify their hostility towards him. According to the lawsuit, the officers approached the stadium's parking lot and commanded the crowd to disperse. Tornetta apparently took too long to vacate the area because of how crowded it was, so the officers allegedly attacked him, pulling at his shirt until it ripped and striking him several times with a baton. Van Wyck and Tennenny were consequently accused of assault and battery, false imprisonment and defamation. The suit was eventually settled outside of court. The terms of the settlement weren't disclosed to the public. Number 2. Brian Daney. On February the 2nd of 2023, 20-year-old Brian Daney sent 2 police officers and a civilian to the hospital while resisting arrest in Queens, New York. Daney had reportedly been working out at New Hyde Park Gym when he got into an argument with a 37-year-old man whose name wasn't disclosed to the public. Police were called after Daney punched the victim in the face, inflicting several bruises and lacerations. The unruly man refused to leave the gym or accompany officers outside and instead attacked the first responders. All 3 of the victims, including the 2 responding police officers, required medical attention. Daney was arrested on several charges, including assault, criminal mischief, and resisting arrest. Number 1. William Peralta. William Peralta was arrested in Long Island, New York, for attacking a police officer during a traffic stop on February the 1st of 2023. According to the police report, officers noticed a 2012 Honda Civic with tinted windows and an obscured license plate traveling at high speeds. 27-year-old Peralta didn't immediately stop when police activated the patrol car's lights, instead abruptly turning left into a parking lot and stepping out of his vehicle. The suspect began walking away, ignoring the officer's commands to stop. When the policeman attempted to restrain him, Peralta reacted violently, injuring one of the officers in the process. He was eventually apprehended and charged with assault, several traffic violations, obstructing governmental administration, and resisting arrest. The wounded trooper was taken to the hospital where he was treated for his injuries. Glamour model and business owner Brittany Rhea Phillips, aged 26, was run over on November the 21st of 2020 by her ex-boyfriend, James Heath Kitchens. The incident, which took place in Starkville, Mississippi, was described by local law enforcement as one of domestic violence, but further details weren't immediately provided. A friend of Phillips's reported that Kitchens, a former police officer for the city of Tupelo in Lee County, was abusive towards her and that their relationship had fallen apart. He was a father to Phillips's youngest child, and it was speculated that he'd refused to accept that she wanted to move on. Law enforcement arrived at the scene on Riviera Road and found that Phillips had been struck by a vehicle driven by 30-year-old Kitchens. The model was taken to a hospital where she was pronounced dead. Kitchens was charged with manslaughter and released on a $25,000 bond. Number 6. Shauna Grice. British teenager Shauna Grice met Michael Lane, who was 8 years her senior, in 2015 when they both worked at Brighton Fire Alarms. They became a couple but eventually broke up, and Grice got back together with her previous boyfriend. By then, however, Lane had become obsessed with her and confided in a friend that Grice would pay for what she's done. On August the 25th of 2016, Lane waited until Grice was alone at her home in Portslade, East Sussex. He made his way inside, cut the 19-year-old's throat, and set her bedroom on fire with her in it. Lane was arrested that day and initially lied to the police about his whereabouts at the time of the murder before admitting that he'd been to Grice's home. He claimed to have found her already dead and that he hadn't alerted anyone for fear of being considered the killer. His trial in the spring of 2017 only lasted a few weeks before he was found guilty and sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years served. The case would earn a great deal of attention, particularly due to the repeated failings of Sussex police in addressing the extensive harassment to which Lane had subjected the victim. From the time that they'd broken up and leading to the murder, there had been multiple instances of increasingly more threatening behavior from Lane. It placed a tracker on Grice's car and caused damage to the vehicle. Grice alerted the police in February and again in March after Lane had grabbed her by the hair and snatched her phone. The man was arrested on suspicion of assault but eventually released, while Grice was fined for wasting the police's time by not disclosing they'd been in a relationship. Other incidents followed that included Lane stalking her, entering her home with a stolen key to watch the teenager as she slept, or repeatedly calling her from blocked numbers. The police ultimately deemed the case low risk, even though Lane had similarly harassed at least a dozen girls and women from 2006 to 2016. On August the 4th of 2016, Grice and a friend saw him loitering outside her home. By then, however, she'd become so disillusioned with the police's response that she was afraid they would react in disbelief and fine her again. Even with a friend as a witness, she didn't alert the authorities. Within weeks, she would be dead. Number 5. Megan Jacquis. Florida woman Megan Jacquis, a former child protective investigator trainee with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, was arrested on multiple charges in 2019, which stemmed from a campaign of harassment she'd led against her ex-boyfriend. Over the course of a year, 25-year-old Jacquis had sent the man hundreds of texts, disguised her number to call him relentlessly, and accessed online accounts in his name. With the sole intention of harassing him, she used his personal information to file for a job application with a plumbing company in August, and also filed false complaints with law enforcement claiming he'd been responsible for noise violations and acts of animal cruelty. Jacquis was arrested on charges that included stalking as well as harassment by use of personal identification and accessing a computer or electronic device without authority. Number 4. Najinski Latasia Dix. After dating for about 3 months, 37-year-old Najinski Latasia Dix and Terry Hickman, aged 44, broke up in May of 2020. NBC Chicago reported that one person familiar with the couple claimed that Dix began stalking Hickman in the aftermath. At the time, Dix was a gender studies PhD candidate at the University of Illinois and an employee at the University of Notre Dame. Approximately 6 months after her relationship with Hickman had ended, she tracked him down to his home in Washington, D.C. On the evening of November the 14th, local police responded to reports of shots fired at the man's residence. Officers found Hickman suffering from gunshot wounds on the floor of his apartment, and Dix talking on the phone to her mother saying, "He pushed me and I shot him." Witnesses told law enforcement that they'd seen the former couple in the parking lot prior to the shooting. They then heard a woman screaming for help after multiple gunshots had rung out and saw Dix pacing on the balcony. Hickman passed away from his injuries. Dix was taken to a hospital where she told staff that she was experiencing memory loss. Doctors found an abrasion on the inside of her left lower lip but couldn't determine the cause and told investigators that the woman didn't appear to have been physically assaulted. While she was questioned at the station, Dix asked detectives to show her items that might unblock her memory. Upon being handed a photo of Hickman, she started crying and repeatedly asked for it to be taken away from her, saying, "You don't do people you love like that. That's not love." She was charged with second-degree murder, and her case was ongoing according to updates on the matter. Number 3. Michelle Felton. Michelle Felton and Ryan Harley from Cheshire, England, had dated from May of 2020 until February of 2022, when their relationship broke down following a physical altercation. Felton kicked Harley in the groin and he accidentally broke her finger in the scrap, but no criminal charges were filed. About 12 days later, Harley ended the relationship, but 28-year-old Felton didn't accept the decision and subsequently bombarded him with texts and calls. In some of them, the woman asked if they were still going out and when they'd meet. When Harley didn't reply, she accused him of cheating on his driver's test. The man repeatedly told her to stop contacting him and that he didn't want to resume their relationship, but Felton wouldn't desist. Harley, who reportedly suffered from anxiety and depression, experienced a great deal of distress from the harassment. It lasted from February the 15th to the 26th, and the woman would call or send him messages up to 150 times on a daily basis. Harley ultimately alerted law enforcement after Felton had begun leaving gifts on his doorstep. He told officers, "I just wanted to go away and for it all to stop." Felton admitted harassment at Warrington Magistrates Court in January of 2023. She was banned from contacting Harley for 18 months and sentenced to an 18-month community order with a requirement she participated in 30 days of rehabilitative activities. Number 2. Ramon Molina. In the spring of 2022, a Florida man was arrested twice by deputies from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office for harassing his ex-girlfriend. For about 2 weeks leading up to April the 26th, the unnamed woman in question had blocked all communication with her ex, 21-year-old Ramon Molina. She had previously told the man that she wanted to move on from the relationship, but he messaged and called her obsessively, even at her workplace. He then went to her home, unannounced, and made his way inside through a back door. The victim locked herself in the bathroom and shouted at him to leave her alone. As she later told the authorities, she'd heard Molina through the door threatening to take away her therapy dog, but he eventually left the residence. He was arrested on stalking charges after midnight on April the 27th and released later in the day after being handed a no-contact order. Molina was taken into custody again on May the 12th for violating the order, when his ex-girlfriend alerted law enforcement that he'd called her from an unknown number. The calls were confirmed by an Instagram conversation between Molina and a third party, in which the former admitted that he'd contacted his ex, describing the move as a mistake and adding that he wouldn't do it again. Number 1. Adam Cobb. In the spring of 2022, Jamie Joyner was in the process of moving out of the house she shared with Adam Cobb, with whom she'd recently broken up after a relationship lasting several years. Jamie's older sister, Jessica Joyner Escott, flew to Illinois from California to help her, and they rented a U-Haul. They drove the vehicle to the property in rural Collinsville to pick up Jamie's belongings and her pet bull, Jada. 30-year-old Jamie had moved from Missouri to the Metro East to be with Cobb a few years prior. By multiple accounts, Cobb had a temper, and in 2018, a woman had filed for a protection order against him. Following a business dispute, he'd reportedly harassed her family in a manner that included taking pictures of her teenage daughter. In the later stages of his relationship with Jamie, whenever she talked about leaving, Cobb would get angry and threaten to hurt her or take away her dog. His obsessive and controlling behavior reached a boiling point on the morning of April the 2nd of 2022, when Jamie and Jessica made the drive to Collinsville. At around 10:30 a.m., a 911 call was placed in which a woman was heard screaming, followed by the sound of gunshots. Responding officers found both sisters and Jada shot dead on the property, while the U-Haul was still parked in the driveway. Based on the proximity of a cell phone to Jamie's body, law enforcement determined that she'd made the call. 32-year-old Cobb became the main suspect in the killings. He'd fled the scene and later that same day engaged the police in a car chase through central Illinois. As shown in body cam footage, subsequently released by the authorities, he eventually stopped his partially disabled pickup truck on US Route 51 north of Panna. Cobb exited the vehicle and pointed a handgun at state troopers, at which point he was shot. He was taken to a regional hospital where he succumbed to his injuries. Number 13. Wayne Roth. In November of 1997, Pennsylvania man Wayne Roth was at the home of his friend Roger Croteau, who had a pet cobra. Roth decided that he wanted to play with the highly venomous reptile. He reached into the tank but the cobra perceived him as a threat and bit the 38-year-old as he picked it up. In spite of his friend's warnings and against what most would argue as common sense, Roth didn't go to the emergency room. Instead, he believed that he'd be able to withstand the reptile's venom, reportedly telling his friend, "I'm a man, I can handle it." Instead of the hospital, Roth went to a bar where he had a few drinks and boasted to other patrons about having just been bit by a cobra. The animal's venom attacks the central nervous system, but it's generally rather slow acting. In spite of Roth's belief in his masculine imperviousness, he ended up dying a few hours later. Number 12. Stephen Winfrey. On New Year's Day 2015, British man Stephen Winfrey was hunting for rabbits near his home in Doncaster, South Yorkshire. On January the 2nd, a passerby found the 50-year-old man with half his body sticking out of a rabbit hole. Winfrey's head was inside, while only his legs and torso were visible. The man had been dead for several hours. The ferrets he'd been using to hunt were found in bags while his dog was discovered tied to a tree nearby. Next to the man's lifeless body was a mound of soil and a dead rabbit. Judging by the scratch marks on the ground, Winfrey had struggled to get out, but his efforts were to no avail. He'd succumbed to asphyxia after sticking his head inside the hole and becoming stuck. Number 11. Daniel Kaluuya. On January the 14th of 2021, a teenager from Benadibeli region in the Democratic Republic of Congo died after striking a soccer ball filled with hardened concrete. The team that 18-year-old Daniel Kaluuya played for had brought the ball and intended to use it to prank their opponents. However, the players then decided to warm up using the concrete ball and to test their abilities to kick it. Kaluuya called for a header and his teammate passed accordingly. The teenager struck the ball with his head and the impact inflicted severe injuries. Kaluuya died as a result, while the player who passed the ball to him reportedly faced charges. Number 10. Quimby Gilotti. On June the 2nd of 1997, teenager Quimby Gilotti died in an accident involving 32 other students from California's Napa High School. They were on a senior class trip to Concord's Waterworld, USA. The students wanted to see how many of them could fit on a single section of the 40-foot-high Banzai Pipeline water slide. By piling into it, they subjected the attraction to weight forces 3 times greater than those for which it had been designed. A section of the slide broke open and twisted upside down as it fell, sending students plummeting to the ground. 18-year-old Gilotti died while over a dozen students were hospitalized as a result of the accident. Number 9. Mauled by Bengal tigers. In May of 1999, 2 elderly German tourists were mauled to death by 3 Bengal tigers at a wildlife park in Spain's Alicante province. The unnamed married couple, both reported as being in their 70s, ignored the warnings issued by staff at Safari El Virgil. The park's safety guidelines stated that visitors should drive on the grounds with their windows rolled up. Signs written in multiple languages informed the couple that they were in a dangerous area and under no circumstances were they to exit their vehicle. Even though their lives were at stake, they still got out of their car. Before long, 3 massive Bengal tigers pounced on them. The felines swiftly inflicted devastating neck injuries, to which the man and his wife would later succumb. Number 8. Explosive selfies. In January of 2015, 2 young men traveling in Russia's Ural Mountains found a live grenade and decided to take a selfie with it. Some sources report that they discovered the explosive weapon without a safety pin, while others claim that they'd pulled the pin out specifically for the selfie. Whatever the case might have been, a grenade without a safety on is extremely dangerous, as this means it's armed and ready for use. Both men were instantly obliterated as the grenade went off in their faces. Only the phone with the picture remained and served as evidence of how they died. In 2017, another grenade selfie went horribly wrong. Russian man Alexander Chechich had sent photos to a friend of him holding the armed explosive in his hand. It's believed that the man couldn't put the safety pin back in, at which point the weapon went off, killing Chechich by tearing his body in half. Number 7. Clifford Ray Jones. In 2016, Detroit man Clifford Ray Jones died in a car crash under rather unusual circumstances. He was watching an X-rated movie on his phone while driving down I-75 without wearing pants. Jones's seatbelt wasn't fastened, and the roof on his 1996 Toyota was open. At some point, the 58-year-old had become too distracted and crashed into a roadway ramp, His vehicle rolled and Jones was ejected through the sunroof, sustained in fatal injuries. Upon reaching the crash site, one Michigan State Police lieutenant referred to the incident as the strangest thing he'd ever encountered on the roadway. Number 6. David Monk. British man David Monk died in the Italian Alps in 2008 from an accident involving an improvised sled. 46-year-old Monk and a few of his friends had removed some of the foam barriers that were used as protection at the end of the run. The men then used them as sledges and sped down the ski slope. In a dark, ironic twist, the men crashed into the very fence from where they'd earlier removed the foam barriers. Monk struck a post with his head and was killed instantly. 2 of his friends were also badly injured, but they survived. Number 5. Jose Tony Alvarez Umanzor. On the 4th of July 2020, a man from Washington, D.C. died in the aftermath of a mishap with fireworks. 33-year-old Jose Tony Alvarez Umanzor was reportedly holding a commercial-grade firework above his head. The mortar-style pyrotechnic device was described as being so powerful that it was deemed illegal in the state. Nevertheless, Umanzor held it above his head after lighting it. Once ignited, the base of the firework ejected downwards, causing critical injuries to the man's head and upper body. Umanzor was rushed to the hospital where he was ultimately pronounced dead. Number 4. Sukram Yadav. In January of 2021, Indian man Sukram Yadav died after what was described as an air compressor enema. The incident occurred in the Katni district of the Madhya Pradesh state. Yadav had been suffering from constipation and asked his friend, 35-year-old Vino Thakur, to help him resolve the matter by inserting an air compressor nozzle into his rectum. Thakur did as asked, and within seconds Yadav's stomach swelled up and he became unconscious. He was rushed to the emergency room and later transferred to a different hospital, where doctors performed 3 surgeries in an attempt to save his life. Unfortunately, the man succumbed to his extensive internal injuries. Even though the matter was attributed to ignorance rather than malevolence, Thakur was arrested by the police. Number 3. Cynthia Covert. In May of 2020, Cynthia Covert was visiting a friend on Kiowa Island near Charleston, South Carolina. At some point, the 58-year-old beautician saw an alligator near the pond behind her friend's house. Covert decided that she wanted to pet the beast, which is frequently mentioned among the deadliest predators in North America. Her friend warned Covert that she'd witnessed the alligator snatch a deer from the water's edge only a few days prior. The woman replied that she didn't look like a deer and proceeded with her plan of touching the animal. It was still immersed in the water when Covert bent over and reached out to pet it. In an instant, the beast lunged at the woman, clamped on her leg, and dragged her in the pond. A struggle ensued, from which Covert emerged, albeit briefly. She only had the chance to jokingly claim that she won't do that again, before the alligator bit her once more. The attack ended with the beast dragging the woman underwater and drowning her. It was later reportedly killed by local wildlife officers, even though it was argued that the beast had simply done what was inherent to its predatory nature. Today's topic was requested by David Chalmers and Forever Army 0482. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Henry Hill Jr. In November of 2020, a man from Kershaw County, South Carolina, died in a fire under what was deemed as entirely preventable circumstances. 68-year-old Henry Hill Jr. had become trapped in his trailer home when it caught fire in the early hours of the morning. Hill and 2 others managed to get out. However, according to the responding firefighters and witnesses from the scene, Hill went back inside the flaming structure to retrieve a pair of pants. The man was found dead on the bedroom floor after succumbing to the intense heat and smoke inhalation. Number 1. Michael Anderson Godwin. In the 1980s, Michael Anderson Godwin was convicted of murder and sentenced to death via the electric chair. However, that verdict was eventually overturned on appeal, and Godwin was given life in prison in 1983. Still, Godwin would end up dying of electrocution several years later. In 1989, the 28-year-old was sitting on a steel toilet in his cell. At the same time, he was trying to repair a pair of headphones that were still connected to his TV set. Godwin would make the fatal mistake of biting into the cable while trying to split and reconnect it. He sustained a massive electric shock and was found dead in his cell at the Central Correctional Institution in South Carolina. The combination of conducting metal and the frayed cable essentially meant that Godwin had died on an electric chair of his own inadvertent design. Law enforcement in Harmony Township, Pennsylvania, were dispatched to the Baruni Hotel and Grill on Duss Avenue one day in October of 2013 after receiving reports of a stabbing. During the preliminary police investigation, it was determined that the incident had been precipitated by trash talk, centered around various sports topics. A male patron at the bar had reportedly been wearing a LeBron James jersey, triggering a heated argument as to whether James or Michael Jordan should be considered the greatest basketball player of all time. The topic eventually shifted to Pittsburgh's local teams, which was when tensions came to a head. A physical altercation subsequently broke out, during the course of which Armando Encinas allegedly pulled out a knife and started stabbing people. Baruni owner Alex Barlamas, employee Robert Gavlua, and patron Timothy Edwards all suffered wounds at the hands of Encinas, who was accompanied by his uncle Michael Landeros. The victims were each hospitalized, but the injuries were reportedly deemed to be non-life-threatening in nature. Both Encinas and Landeros were arrested in the incident's wake. The former was charged with attempted homicide and aggravated assault, while his uncle faced counts of misdemeanor, disorderly conduct, and simple assault. Number 6. Jessica Beauvais. New York woman Jessica Beauvais went on a drunken rant about her profound antipathy towards the police during a Facebook live stream on April the 26th of 2021. The 32-year-old Long Island mother was downing tequila shots, wine, and other alcoholic beverages on camera while talking about the trial of ex-Minnesota police officer Derek Chauvin, who was criminally charged in connection to the highly publicized death of George Floyd back in the summer of 2020. Throughout the nearly 2-hour live stream, Beauvais directed a number of derogatory remarks towards law enforcement and slammed the American justice system, all while NWA's F the Police played in the background. In the early hours of the following morning, the woman got behind the wheel of her maroon Volkswagen despite still being intoxicated. She blazed down the Long Island Expressway and eventually found herself in the path of a 14-year NYPD veteran named Anastasios Sakos. At the time, the latter was directing traffic away from a deadly car accident that had taken place on the expressway in Queens. When he noticed Beauvais' vehicle barreling towards him, 43-year-old Sakos ran for his life, but she slammed into him before he could get to safety. The officer was hit with such force that he was knocked out of his department-issued knee-high work boots, and his body went flying through the air before landing on a grassy median about 200 feet away. Beauvais' windshield was completely shattered as a consequence of the impact, but she nevertheless continued driving past multiple exits. When she was finally pulled over, the woman feigned ignorance in regards to the deadly crash, saying, "I did hear a thump, so I knew I hit something, but I didn't see what it was." Her blood alcohol level, which was tested a couple of hours after the incident, was determined to be nearly twice the legal driving limit, and she was also found to have been driving with a suspended license. Following her subsequent arrest, Beauvais was charged with second-degree manslaughter, second-degree aggravated manslaughter, second-degree vehicular manslaughter, and leaving the scene of an incident without reporting. She consequently faced the possibility of spending up to 15 years behind bars for the crime. It was reported that the trial would likely begin in the spring of 2023. Number 5. Justin Carter. A sarcastic comment made during an exchange of trash talk on Facebook landed a Texas teen behind bars. In February of 2013, 18-year-old Justin Carter and a friend were arguing with another individual about something related to the online multiplayer game League of Legends. At one point during the heated interaction, Carter claimed to be messed up in the head and wrote, "I think I'ma shoot up a kindergarten and watch the blood of the innocent rain down," before saying he'd eat his victim's beating heart. The teen, a New Braunfels resident, followed up the alarming pronouncement with LOL and JK in an apparent indication that his threats had been made in jest. Carter's comment, which he posted just 2 months after the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, caught the attention of a woman in Canada who reported it to the authorities. Local law enforcement subsequently issued a warrant for Carter's arrest. He was taken into custody on a felony charge of making threats and was held at the Comal County Jail on a $500,000 bond. Facing the possibility of spending several years in prison, the young man admitted to making the snarky Facebook comment when questioned by police, but he and his attorney contended that it was completely harmless. A 4-year legal fight ensued wherein Carter, his family, and his supporters sought to have his criminal charges dismissed. Finally, in March of 2018, Carter pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of creating a false alarm. His felony charge was dropped and he was released with credit for time served. Number 4. Marte Logan. 24-year-old Terry Lowe was gunned down outside a liquor store in the 200 block of South Laramie Avenue in Chicago's Austin neighborhood on November the 13th of 2022. It would later emerge that the young man had exchanged a few choice words with Marte Logan, who rode around the block before emerging from the back seat of a car and opening fire. Lowe sustained gunshot wounds to his eye, face, head, torso, back, and legs and was pronounced dead at Stroger Hospital a short time after the shooting. Later that night, 20-year-old Logan reportedly boasted about committing the murder to a teenage girl. The following day, he showed the unnamed girl a picture of Lowe that had been uploaded by Legal Help, a website that publishes bulletins of murder victims to seek information. Then on November the 24th, Logan got into an argument with the girl and a 17-year-old boy. He tailed them to the 2900 block of West Roosevelt Road, where he fired 8 rounds in their direction, then followed them onto the Eisenhower Expressway and fired more shots. The female victim was hit in the back and head, while her male companion was shot in the leg and the back as well. Both of the teens fortunately survived. Logan was arrested in December and consequently faced 1 felony count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder. Number 3. Zachary Gardner. In March of 2015, 22-year-old Huey Stanley Jr. and his cousins, Albert and Josh Cornell, went to the YMCA in Kingsport, Tennessee to play basketball. When they arrived, they came across a group of 4 teens, whom Albert was familiar with, and asked if they wanted to play a pickup game. They declined the offer and began playing amongst themselves, at which point Stanley started hurling insults at the group, directing much of his trash talk towards one teen in particular. The two exchanged words, with Stanley indicating he'd be willing to physically fight the boy if he were older. The teen subsequently called his brother, 22-year-old Zachary Gardner, to brawl with Stanley for him. In court, eyewitness testimony would later reveal that Stanley and his cousins went to a gas station while awaiting Gardner's arrival at the gym. When the two parties showed back up at the YMCA, a confrontation ensued. Gardner taunted Stanley for picking on a teenager, but the situation then abruptly turned violent. Stanley punched Gardner in the head, and after a brief fist fight, the latter pulled out a knife. The other young man was stabbed twice, once in the neck and once in the chest. The Cornell brothers rushed their cousin to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. In the aftermath, Gardner was taken into police custody on a charge of first-degree murder. Throughout the ensuing criminal proceedings, the young man maintained that he'd acted in self-defense during his deadly altercation with Stanley. The prosecution contended that Gardner had premeditated the murder, but much of the testimony provided by the state's witnesses seemed to suggest that the defendant had been attacked initially before retaliating in the interest of self-preservation. In June of 2016, after deliberating for 2.5 hours, a jury found Gardner not guilty of murder, and he was subsequently released from custody. Number 2. Kalaran Watson. On the evening of July the 7th of 2022, the police in Dayton, Ohio, were called to the O'Reilly Auto Parts store on West 3rd Street for a report of a shooting on the premises. Upon arrival, officers found a woman suffering from a non-life-threatening gunshot wound. She was taken to Miami Valley Hospital by her boyfriend and was discharged a few days later. As was captured on cell phone video that subsequently went viral, the victim had been involved in a physical altercation with one of the store's employees, identified as 31-year-old Kalaran Watson. The latter had reportedly been helping the woman find a car part when she became upset and started making threats. Watson told investigators that the customer beat her about the head with her fists, and the two women subsequently brawled in the middle of the store. At one point, they broke away from one another, whereupon Watson retrieved a firearm and shot the other woman. She claimed to have acted in self-defense because she thought the customer was ramping up for another attack when she fired the weapon preemptively. Watson was taken into custody on 2 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of felonious assault, with her bond set at a reported $50,000. Number 1. Cameron Hogg. On October 3rd of 2022, contentious trash talk erupted after a pickup basketball game between 2 friends at Terry Park in Dallas, Texas. In subsequent reports, the individuals involved were identified as 31-year-old Cameron Hogg and Asia Womack, aged 21. The latter won the game, after which she began teasing Hogg, who evidently took the loss to heart and subsequently lashed out in violence. A short time after the pickup game, Hogg tracked Womack down to another location where she and a friend were sitting outside with a TV hooked up, watching football. Hogg pulled out a firearm and shot the young woman multiple times, killing her. He remained on the run from the authorities until October the 22nd, when he was finally taken into custody on a murder charge. The man reportedly had a criminal history, including past arrests for robbery, domestic violence, and aggravated assault. Hogg remained in the Dallas County Jail without bond as he awaited the next steps of the legal proceedings. Australian couple Caitlin O'Brien and Shay Sturt had a contentious relationship spanning over a decade. The first domestic incident reported to the police was in 2008, when an argument about moving furniture in O'Brien's Melbourne apartment turned violent. The young woman told local law enforcement that Sturt had struck her, but she later withdrew the complaint. O'Brien, who worked as a nurse, reportedly fled from her home following another violent altercation 2 years later. Sturt had become agitated after O'Brien suggested he might need psychological help. He went on to pull her by the hair and punch her several times before she escaped. The man consequently faced assault charges but was placed on an adjourned good behavior bond. In the years that followed, O'Brien made over 30 visits to her general practitioner due to injuries she sustained from her partner's physical attacks. Following each domestic episode, she would report Sturt to the police only to be manipulated into dropping the case. Sturt was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia-type personality disorder, which was being worsened by his excessive cannabis use. On several occasions, his mental health problems landed him in the hospital as he struggled to keep his paranoid delusions at bay. Despite Sturt's violent tendencies, O'Brien never received the help she was so desperate for, and the situation took a drastic turn in the summer of 2019. In May, O'Brien underwent a procedure to remove a tumor from her brain. She was forced to stay home throughout the recovery process, which started to put an untenable strain on her relationship with Sturt, whose condition was only worsening. He told O'Brien he thought the neighbors were worshipping Satan and that she herself was a devil. The man even made claims that he was Jesus and instructed O'Brien to eat an apple so she could be enlightened like Adam and Eve. On June the 23rd, the woman decided she'd had enough. She called the police on Sturt, who was behaving very erratically. He was taken to the Alfred Hospital, where he was detained under the Mental Health Act as doctors made their assessment. O'Brien was fearful that Sturt might murder her in the midst of a psychotic episode, a concern she expressed to him while he was in the hospital. As she was making arrangements to hide out at an ex-boyfriend's place, the hospital abruptly released Sturt, who'd somehow convinced the doctors that he was of stable mind. On June the 25th, only 2 days after he was admitted to the mental health ward, Sturt went to O'Brien's flat and unleashed a brutal attack, stabbing her with scissors, smothering her with a pillow, and tying pants tightly around her neck to ensure she was dead. While in jail awaiting the resulting murder trial, Sturt penned handwritten letters detailing the extent of his descent into madness. In the notes, He indicated that O'Brien would likely still be alive if the authorities hadn't chosen to release him after only a few hours of observation. He ultimately agreed to a plea deal and was given a 22-year prison term, of which he'd need to serve 16 years before being eligible for parole. Number 10. Alex Staines. In January of 2021, English police constables Gemma Walsh-Beasley and Mike McDermott were dispatched to investigate a domestic violence report at a home in Welwyn Garden City, Hertfordshire. 25-year-old Christy Fruin told the officers that her ex-boyfriend, Alex Staines, had harassed, stalked, and assaulted her on several occasions during their years-long relationship, and had even left their children alone in the house to track her whereabouts. At the time, 30-year-old Staines was out on bond in connection with a previous incident that led to Fruin being labeled a high-risk domestic abuse victim in law enforcement databases. Nevertheless, Constables Walsh, Beasley and McDermott declined to arrest Staines for his latest abuse and even allowed the couple's 2 youngest children to stay with him overnight. The next morning, when he went to drop the kids off at Fruin's place, he forced his way inside and grabbed a large kitchen knife. A merciless, frenzied attack ensued over the next 6 minutes. The Staines repeatedly plunged a knife into Fruin's face, neck, throat, and arm, where she had a tattoo of the man's name. Despite Fruin's cries for help to the police and Staines' past death threats against the woman, there were no barriers put in place to thwart the fatal attack. In June of 2021, Staines was jailed for life, with his minimum term set at 22 years. Constables Walsh, Beasley and McDermott were investigated by the Independent Office for Police Conduct. It was determined that the officers had failed to adequately investigate the allegations against Staines and hadn't complied with standard procedures in regards to domestic abuse. As punishment, Walsh, Beasley and McDermott were both issued formal written warnings. Number 9. Trevor Heitman. On August the 23rd of 2018, the police in San Diego, California, received a call from a psychiatrist concerned for the mental well-being of a family friend. "I'm calling to report an emergency. I believe there's an individual who is a danger to himself and to others." The caller told law enforcement, who subsequently dispatched 3 officers to the home of 18-year-old Trevor Heitman. The young man, who'd amassed nearly 900,000 YouTube subscribers under the alias McSkillet, was asleep upstairs when the police arrived. They spoke with his parents, who asked him to help get their son to a doctor. The teen's mother informed the officers that he'd sent her a threatening text message and ordered her to leave the house. She went on to describe Heitman's manic behavior while imploring the police to have him checked out by mental health professionals. One of the officers downplayed how involved they'd be allowed to be, given that Heitman had never been officially diagnosed with a mental disorder. The policeman added, "He has to be gravely disabled. He has to have a credible threat against somebody." A short time later, the family friend who dialed 911 arrived and pleaded with the officers to help Heitman, indicating the teen was likely to do something violent if left to his own devices. Eventually, the officers left without taking any action. Hours later, Heitman awoke and left the house, getting behind the wheel of his McLaren, which he'd purchased with a portion of his considerable YouTube earnings. He bumped into his father's vehicle on his way out of the driveway before busting through a fence and speeding off. Heitman took his McLaren onto I-805 but started driving southbound in the northbound lanes. He eventually slammed into an oncoming SUV at a speed of over 100 miles per hour. The collision killed the other motorist, her daughter, and Heitman himself. The California Highway Patrol stated that the crash caused a chain reaction that came to involve at least 5 other vehicles. While Heitman was a popular gaming YouTuber with a sizable online following and millions of dollars to his name, his state of mind had been rapidly declining leading up to the incident. He had only a few friends in real life, the majority of whom were in the process of moving away to college, leaving him at home alone in the late summer of 2020. Heitman's family announced that they'd be pursuing litigation against the city of San Diego, accusing law enforcement of not doing enough to prevent the deadly events of August the 23rd of 2018. News of the suit was accompanied by the release of body cam footage from San Diego Police's initial response to Heitman's house. Many were critical of the responding officers' seemingly uncaring and nonchalant attitude towards what they were being told was a serious situation. Number 8. Dylan Dowman. On August the 15th of 2022, Toronto Police Constable Anson Alfonso and his partner, Constable Sang Yub Lee, were called to the scene of a reported domestic incident. They spoke with 23-year-old Daniela Malia, who who claimed that her ex-boyfriend had been harassing her and sending threatening text messages. The interaction, which was recorded by police-worn body cameras, lasted about 39 minutes, during which time the officers were said to have gathered sufficient evidence that provided reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offense had occurred. However, Constable Alfonso reportedly spoke with the ex-boyfriend, Dylan Dowman, for only 3 minutes before leaving and failing to take any further action to protect Malia. 3 days later, the young woman was found dead in an underground garage near Jane Street and Shepherd Avenue. Dowman had fatally shot her. He was ultimately arrested on a charge of first-degree murder, but the police constables who'd ignored Malia's cries for help also faced legal repercussions as a result of the incident. According to police tribunal records, Constable Alfonso failed to adequately investigate the domestic report, improperly considering it a he-said-she-said situation. He was also accused of providing an inaccurate account of the call to his supervisor, indicating there wasn't an imminent threat against Malia despite ample evidence that there was. When the supervisor asked Alfonso whether there was information linking either Malia or Dowman to firearms, the constable said no. However, at the time of the visit to Malia's residence, Dowman reportedly had an active firearm prohibition from past offenses. Both Alfonso and Constable Lee faced Police Act charges including deceit, neglect of duty, and making false or misleading statements. Toronto police officials revealed that Alfonso, a 4-year veteran of the force, was suspended with pay while the case made its way through the courts. As per the terms of the Police Services Act, the city's police chief met with the victim's family to inform them of his officers' alleged misconduct and to notify them of charges laid by the force's Professional Standards Unit. The president of the Toronto Police Association called the incident tragic for everyone involved and reiterated that although it's difficult, we must wait for the disciplinary process to take its course. Number 7. Joseph Cass. 38-year-old Scott Dunster from the UK had his car broken into outside his home in Eastbourne, East Sussex on New Year's Eve 2022. The burglar reportedly stole his wife's purse and also snagged the couple's joint bank card before fleeing the scene. Dunster subsequently noticed that a charge for roughly $75 had been made at an off-license store using his and his wife's card. The father of 3 reported both the theft and the unauthorized charge to Sussex Police, which processed the report at about 7:45 a.m. on December the 31st. In a statement later made by a department spokesperson, it was revealed that the report was then allocated to a local officer for further investigation, but Dunster claimed that he received no indication that he'd be receiving help from law enforcement. The man ultimately decided to take matters into his own hands rather than rely on the police. He went down to the shop where the burglar had used the card and was able to obtain CCTV footage of the unauthorized transaction as well as the thief himself. Dunster took screenshots of the footage and posted them to Facebook, enlisting the help of the general public in identifying the criminal. Local social media users positively identified him as 27-year-old Joseph Cass. On the afternoon of January the 2nd of 2023, Dunster's friend spotted Cass in the Eastbourne town centre. Simultaneously, Sussex officers were dealing with an unrelated incident nearby, and Dunstan was unable to reach anyone using 101, the police's non-emergency line. Seeking to bring a swift resolution, Dunster chased after Cass himself. He reportedly pursued the suspect through the town centre for about 600 yards before tackling him and pinning him to the ground with the help of security stewards. The nearby officers subsequently arrived to take Cass into custody. He was charged with fraud by false representation, to which he pleaded guilty at Brighton Magistrates Court the following day. Cass was later jailed for 35 weeks as punishment. A member of Sussex Police's Criminal Investigations Department said in a statement, "We commend the victim for being so proactive and providing us with additional information, which led to Cass's being apprehended." Dunster, however, was highly critical of the authorities' handling of his ordeal, indicating he was angry that he needed to risk his own life to catch the thief. Number 6. Stefan Seltve. In July of 2013, reports surfaced online about a pending lawsuit against the city of Eugene, Oregon. The chief of police and a police department supervisor who were accused of failing to halt harassment and abuse by one of their own officers. 44-year-old Stefan Seltve, a 17-year-old veteran of the Eugene police force, had his duties scaled back in October of 2012 as the controversy surrounding his alleged mistreatment of 6 different women, including co-workers and a fellow officer's wife, started to heat up. In December of that year, Seltve was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation into his misconduct. Back in July, a female Eugene officer had gone to her superiors to report that Seltvay had been inappropriately pestering her since she was a new recruit over a decade earlier. Several other female department employees made similar complaints against the veteran officer. His creepy behavior and repeated unwanted advances had been largely overlooked over the years. In subsequent reports, it was revealed that some within the department refrained from dealing with the situation out of loyalty to Seltvay's wife, who also worked for the police. The lead internal investigator called the man's actions despicable, while urging other victims of his abuse to step forward and voice their stories. On July the 24th of 2013, Seltvay, who'd resigned from the force by that point, pleaded guilty to misdemeanor harassment and abuse charges and was consequently sentenced to 140 days in jail. He was also ordered to register as an offender. As his punishment was being handed down, Seltvay issued an apology to the co-workers he'd victimized, stating he'd brought shame to the department and the community. The resulting lawsuit against the city and police officials was filed by two of Seltvay's victims, identified only as Jane Doe and Jean Coe. The plaintiffs alleged that Seltvay's touching and harassing of women was well known in police circles, but that supervisors had ignored the pervasive knowledge that he was a dangerous predator. The most readily available updates on the case failed to mention if any resolution had ever been reached. Number 5. The killing of Banaz Mahmood. When she was only a teenager, Banaz Mahmood from Mitcham, South London, was forced into an arranged marriage with a man from her family's hometown of Kaladzia in Iraqi Kurdistan. Her husband, who was 10 years her senior, was described as illiterate and old-fashioned. The police were called to their residence on numerous occasions throughout their marriage for reports of Banaz being beaten and taken advantage of. While the young woman's relatives were aware of the violence, they told her that abandoning the marriage would bring dishonor to the family. In spite of her family's wishes, Banaz eventually ended their relationship, returning to the family home in July of 2005. Around that time, she started dating a man of her own choosing, whom the rest of her family disapproved of, particularly her father and uncle. In a meeting held at the latter's home in December of 2005, the family decided to kill both Banaz and her new boyfriend for the shame they supposedly brought upon the community. On December the 2nd, Banaz went to the police after overhearing a conversation about the murder plot between her uncle and mother. 10 days later, after law enforcement hadn't taken any action in connection with her report, she delivered a letter to the Wimbledon police station in which she provided the names of each of the relatives who wanted her dead. Then on New Year's Eve, the police were called to a cafe in Wimbledon, where Banaz said her father had made an attempt on her life. Officers noted that she was intoxicated, but she claimed it was her father who'd forced her to drink. She had cuts on her hands, having smashed a window during her escape, and was clearly in a distressed state. However, the police constable who responded to the scene didn't believe Banaz's claims against her father, describing her as manipulative and melodramatic. The officer even wanted to criminally charge Banaz for breaking the glass window. With nowhere else to turn, the young woman was forced to face her family's wrath without the aid of law enforcement. On January the 24th of 2006, Banaz was sleeping at the family home alone. Later that morning, two of her cousins, along with a man by the name of Mohammed Marid Hama, arrived and subjected her to more than 2 hours of abuse and torture before fatally strangling her with a ligature. The following day, her boyfriend reported her missing to the police, who didn't take the report seriously at first. Banaz's family insisted that she wasn't missing and that she was known to stay out overnight. The boyfriend ended up harassing the authorities into taking action, and the case was handed over to the Metropolitan Police Homicide and Serious Crime Command. Despite attempts by members of the wider Kurdish community to stymie the investigation, the police were able to arrest Mohammed Marid Hama in early February. While in custody, the suspect was covertly recorded as he bragged about the murder, implicating the victim's uncle, cousins, and father in the process. The recorded conversations, along with phone and vehicle tracking data, allowed law enforcement to locate Banaz's remains in late April. A few days later, her uncle was arrested for murder. Her father faced the same charge 3 months later. In all, 7 individuals were criminally charged in connection with Banaz's honor killing. Mohammed Marid Hama, as well as the victim's father and uncle, were each jailed for life. The 2 cousins present at the murder scene were likewise given life sentences, while a third cousin faced 8 years imprisonment. In the aftermath, the Independent Police Complaints Commission investigated law enforcement's handling of the situation leading up to Banaz's murder. Although the commission found that the victim had been let down by the police, the constable who responded to the scene at the Wimbledon cafe was only given the lowest disciplinary sanction and was subsequently promoted. Number 4. Robb Elementary School shooting. Shortly after 11 a.m. on May the 24th of 2022, Texas teen Salvador Ramos shot his grandmother in the face following an argument over a phone bill at their Uvalde residence. The 18-year-old then got into his grandmother's pickup truck with a tactical vest and AR-15 style rifle in tow and made his way towards Robb Elementary School. Ramos sent a private Facebook message to a German teen he'd met online indicating his plans to commit a mass killing at his old elementary school. He crashed the truck through a barricade outside the school before hopping the fence to gain access to the grounds. Several 911 calls were placed about the crashed vehicle, prompting a school resource officer to drive to the campus. Upon his arrival, he pursued a teacher, whom he erroneously believed to be the perpetrator, driving right past Ramos in the process. As the latter was approaching the school building, an officer reportedly had his rifle aimed directly at him. However, the officer failed to subdue the impending school shooter because he didn't have authorization to fire from his supervisor. Ramos entered the building and walked down the hallway before entering classroom 111, which was internally connected to classroom 112. Testimony from surviving witnesses revealed that the young man announced, "You're all gonna die," before opening fire. The majority of the bloodshed took place within the next few minutes, but Ramos remained barricaded inside the classroom for over an hour while standing off with police. Uvalde law enforcement's response to the scene has been criticized for its lack of urgency and effectiveness. The Texas Department of Public Safety stated that prior to the arrival of tactical units, there were at least 19 police officers inside the school who made no effort to gain entry to the room where Ramos was holed up. According to further department findings, the decision to wait for the arrival of tactical units was made under the false belief that Ramos had been sequestered to a classroom where he could do no more harm. Arnulfo Reyes, a teacher in classroom 111, recounted how he heard law enforcement approach his classroom from what sounded like the hallway 3 times, but they didn't enter. On one such occasion, Reyes heard a student in the adjoining room shout, "Officer, we're in here, we're in here!" At which point, Ramos unloaded another barrage of bullets. Authorities were unable to establish negotiations with the suspect, and on body cam footage there was even a point where he was audibly and profanely taunting them as they waited to obtain a master key from the janitor to unlock the classroom door. Officers were joined by U.S. Border Patrol tactical agents with a ballistic shield. There was evidence that the classroom door was unlocked the whole time, however, and law enforcement subsequently rushed inside. They were met with fire from Ramos, who was hiding in a closet, but they killed him with return fire. A report conducted by the Texas House of Representatives Investigative Committee found systemic failures and egregious poor decision-making by responding law enforcement. The report cited an unacceptably long period of time before officers breached the classroom and began rescue efforts. There were 22 fatalities as a result of the incident, including Ramos himself. Another 18 were injured, including Ramos's grandmother, who survived after being airlifted to a hospital in San Antonio. In the aftermath of the shooting, Robb Elementary was permanently closed and slated to be demolished. Number 3. Cleotha Henderson. During the early hours of July the 5th of 2021, a car pulled up to the loading dock on the grounds of FedEx Freight's operations facility at 461 Winchester Road in Memphis, Tennessee. A male suspect subsequently stole 7 television sets before fleeing the scene. At the time of the theft, the facility was closed for Independence Day, leaving only the security guard on the property. The man on duty that night was Cleotha Henderson, who'd managed to find and hold down a job in security despite his criminal record, which included a stint in prison less than a year earlier. 12 days later, FedEx Freight suffered a second break-in, during which 2 male suspects entered the property through a dock door before pilfering several boxes of Nike apparel worth a total of $2,500. An affidavit of complaint the following month listed Henderson as the suspect in both thefts, and a warrant was thus issued for his arrest. Given his record, the man could have faced an additional 2 to 4 years in prison if convicted of the burglaries. A couple of months later, Henderson began talking to a woman on a dating app. The pair met in person for the first time on September the 21st, about a week after they'd initially begun conversing. The woman, identified as 22-year-old Alicia Franklin, later told investigators that upon meeting up with Henderson, he pulled out a gun, blindfolded her, and took her to a vacant lot behind the lakes at Ridgeway apartment complex where he abused her. Franklin immediately reported the crime to Memphis police. the young woman didn't receive the urgent response from law enforcement that she was hoping for, and the case subsequently languished without any further developments for the better part of a year. In June of 2022, Henderson was taken into custody in connection with the FedEx burglaries, but the charges were dropped because of a lack of evidence and the man was released. On September the 2nd of 2022, Henderson stalked a woman who was out for an early morning jog on the University of Memphis campus. He eventually forced her into his car at gunpoint and killed her. The victim was identified as teacher, mother of two, and business heiress Eliza Fletcher. 3 days later, her body was found behind an abandoned house following a massive search effort by local authorities. Memphis police identified Henderson as a suspect and took him back into custody on murder charges. Following his latest arrest, investigators finally linked him to Franklin's assault almost a year after the fact. He consequently faced charges in connection with that incident as well. Franklin subsequently filed a lawsuit against the city of Memphis, alleging that the police's failure to properly investigate her attack had enabled Henderson to victimize Fletcher, this time to the extent of murder. In a 25-page court filing, city officials admitted that law enforcement had been aware of Franklin's report all the way back in September of 2021. However, they refuted that the young woman had been able to positively identify her attacker to officers. Franklin questioned why DNA evidence of her assault was left to sit on a shelf in a crime lab for nearly a year before being examined. She also claimed to have suffered emotional damages as a result of the ordeal. In February of 2023, Henderson pleaded not guilty to his various crimes. He was subsequently due back in court in late March. Around that time, Judge Mary Wagner of the Shelby County Circuit Court submitted an order dismissing Franklin's lawsuit. Number 2. Queensland First Nations women. In the summer of 2022, a whistleblower from the Queensland Police Service publicly claimed that department officials had instructed her to withhold evidence of police failures in multiple domestic violence cases. The officer, who wished to remain anonymous, had been on the force for more than 20 years, working as a police liaison to the Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Unit of the State Coroner's Office. According to her allegations, there had been at least 4 separate domestic violence cases involving First Nations women over a 6-month period, all of which were not properly investigated by senior officers. In each case, the Indigenous victims were eventually killed by their partners, but their deaths were officially investigated as drug overdoses. The whistleblower said she was criticized by colleagues within the police department who complained when she sent the cases to the coroner's office for further review. She also claimed that reports about police involvement in family violence-related deaths were regularly redacted, removing information regarding inadequate police actions and/or inaction. In 2021, the officer made a formal complaint to the Crime and Corruption Commission about the request to withhold evidence. The commission then moved to investigate her claims but placed the internal review in the hands of a police officer whose direct supervisor was one of the 2 senior officers named in the complaint. The whistleblower asked for the case to be relocated to someone who could be trusted to review the data impartially. Her request was denied and the investigation ultimately found no evidence of police wrongdoing. Number 1. John Wharton. On the morning of February the 8th of 2013, police in the village of Franklin in Birmingham, England, received a call from a 9-year-old girl who said she was unable to wake either of her parents. The child noted that her mother's face had been swollen the night before and also indicated that her father had been looking after her mother. Authorities immediately noticed that there was a high-risk domestic violence marker on the residence. Officers arrived at the scene within minutes, whereupon they determined that both 34-year-old Suzanne Van Hagen and her partner, John Wharton, were deceased. The child who made the call had found Van Hagen, her mother, lying dead beside a mattress in the bedroom, while Wharton, her father, was in the living room. First responders brought the child to nearby Birmingham Children's Hospital, where it was determined that she was unharmed. During the resulting police investigation, it emerged that 37-year-old Wharton had been abusive throughout his and Van Hagen's relationship. The first signs of physical abuse came in 2011, when the woman's hairdresser noticed she had a black eye. Van Hagen claimed to have sustained the injury in a quad bike accident, but the hairdresser, as well as Van Hagen's loved ones, knew that wasn't true. The woman's sisters subsequently confronted Wharton, who became furious and aggressive. His demeanor grew so hostile that the sisters eventually needed to leave the house for fear of being physically attacked themselves. Over the course of the next 18 months, Van Hagen became increasingly isolated from her family before ceasing all contact with them altogether. The Van Hagens tried repeatedly to notify police and social services of the threat Wharton posted Suzanne and the couple's daughter. They were largely ignored, however, despite Wharton's past criminal convictions, which had led to him spending some time in a mental hospital. While investigating the crime scene on February the 8th, authorities noted that there were strangulation marks on Van Hagen's neck, leading to the assumption that Wharton had murdered her. Officers informed the victim's relatives of their belief that she had been killed by her partner. However, a post-mortem examination revealed the presence of drugs in the systems of both deceased, so investigators pivoted. They started running with the working theory that the couple had accidentally overdosed during an intimate game. A press release was even issued to that effect in March of 2013, which thoroughly angered Van Hagen's family. They knew that she'd been murdered, but the police were seemingly unwilling to make that determination in spite of the abundance of evidence. In 2017, West Midlands Police finally commenced a review of the officer's actions before and after Van Hagen's death. The report described a series of failures by those involved in the investigation, concluding that Van Hagen and her child should have been removed from the abusive household long before the situation escalated out of control. It also stated that law enforcement's decision to shut down the homicide investigation following the discovery of drugs in the couple's systems had been misguided. West Midlands Police neglected to make a public comment on the report for 4 whole years. On September the 10th of 2021, the department uploaded a YouTube video of their chief constable, David Thompson, reading an apology to the Van Hagen family. Despite the admission of failure, the department still refrained from calling Van Hagen's death a homicide and didn't even send a link to their YouTube apology to the family, who had to look it up themselves. In 2022, it was reported that the couple's daughter, now 18 years old, was slated to study nursing at university. The police in Pasadena, Texas, were called to an apartment on Burke Road near Fairmont shortly before 3:30 a.m. on July the 11th of 2022. Dispatchers received an emergency call from 22-year-old Bobby Wolf, who claimed he'd accidentally shot his girlfriend. Wolf reportedly heard someone trying to break into the apartment and grabbed his weapon to defend himself from what he thought was an intruder. He fired 7 shots, 6 of which connected with his target, who happened to be his partner, Krishina Lee. The latter was taken to the hospital where she later died. Wolf reportedly stayed at the scene and cooperated with investigators, telling them he thought Lee was a burglar. The family of the victim later disputed his account of the events that led to the shooting. Lee's cousin, Tasha McCoy, told ABC that the couple had a history of domestic violence. McCoy added that Wolf had been stalking Lee, saying he just wouldn't leave her alone. Wolf was later accused of intentionally killing Lee. As of the latest updates, the young man was being held in custody at the Harris County Jail on a $500,000 bond, charged with second-degree manslaughter. Number 9. Gina Williams. 48-year-old Gina Williams left work early during the early hours of January the 20th of 2017 and was shot by her husband, who thought she was a trespasser. The incident unfolded at the family's home in Goldsboro, North Carolina. One of the woman's children was awakened by a noise. The child then woke up Gina's 49-year-old husband, Billy, who grabbed his gun from the safe in one of the bedrooms and went to the front door. Upon opening the door, he saw the outline of a person but couldn't identify who it was because the porch light was turned off. Billy fired his weapon once, hitting Gina in the neck. Emergency medical personnel found the victim lying on the porch when they arrived, while Billy was attempting to administer first aid. The man later told police that he'd been expecting his wife to be home from her 12-hour shift at around 6 a.m. and hadn't anticipated her arriving so many hours earlier. In the aftermath, no charges were filed. Billy posted on his social media account saying he'd have to live with an unshakable burden for the rest of his life. He also revealed in the post that Gina's last words to him were, "I love you." Number 8. Alicia Gaston. In the early hours of January the 14th of 2016, 36-year-old Noah Gaston awoke to what he claimed sounded like walkie-talkies on the first floor of his home in Windham, Maine. He checked on his 3 children and then grabbed a shotgun. As he approached the stairwell, he encountered an individual coming up the stairs and opened fire. Unfortunately, it wasn't an intruder, but rather Noah's 34-year-old wife, Alicia, who fell down the stairs after being blasted with gunfire. Noah subsequently called 911 and notified authorities of the situation. The dispatcher instructed him on how to give his wife chest compressions while awaiting medical personnel. Upon arriving at the scene shortly after 6 a.m., paramedics attempted to revive Alicia, but she succumbed to the gunshot wounds and was pronounced dead. 2 months later, a grand jury indicted Noah on 1 count of intentional or knowing murder and 1 count of manslaughter. On February 11th of 2019, Noah pleaded not guilty to both counts. When the victim's sister took the stand, she was asked by the defense attorney if Noah loved Alicia, to which she replied, "I don't know." After he was found guilty in November of that same year, the court entered a judgment of conviction on the verdict, sentencing Noah to 40 years in the Department of Corrections. Number 7. Cesar Montelongo Sr. A Texas maintenance worker's lifeless body was found on the balcony of a Grand Prairie apartment complex on Christmas Eve 2022. Cesar Montelongo Sr. was checking on frozen and broken water lines that had ruptured at the Clayton Point Apartments on Alouette Drive. A resident who believed his apartment was being burglarized grabbed a gun and fired a single shot, hitting the 53-year-old through the window. The victim was found by responding officers at around 6 p.m. He was subsequently rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The man responsible for the shooting cooperated with detectives as they questioned him at his apartment. The case would later be referred to a Tarrant County grand jury for review. On January the 17th of 2023, a lawsuit against the apartment complex and the shooter was filed on behalf of Montelongo's family. The suit sought damages in excess of $1 million, alleging that the complex's management company, the Valcap Group LLC, failed to adequately inform residents about the pipe's maintenance and repair. Number 6. Joe Frazier, Jr. In the city of Wyoming, Ohio, a man who'd been cleaning out his late grandmother's house was shot just after midnight on January the 30th of 2023. Local police were responding to the apartment on Durrell Avenue after receiving reports of a burglary in progress. According to the Wyoming police chiefs, officers found Joe Frazier Jr. and his father at the rear of the residence and thought they might be committing a home invasion. 28-year-old Joe Jr. refused to get out of his minivan when commanded to do so by police. Subsequently, the vehicle began moving in reverse before crashing into a tree, at which point it accelerated towards the officers, who fired 4 shots at the driver. Joe Jr. was shot and the vehicle slammed into the building while his father fled. The officers forced their way into the vehicle, pulled Joe Jr. out and administered him life-saving care before transporting him to a hospital where he died the following day. The Frazier family revealed that Joe Jr. and his dad had been helping his sister clear out the apartment. The officers who'd fired their guns were later placed on paid administrative leave. Authorities said that Joe Jr. and his father, who had active warrants related to previous offenses, absconded when police confronted them. On February the 3rd, the Hamilton County prosecutor announced that no charges were being filed against the Wyoming officers, saying the shooting was an act of self-defense. Number 5. Lindo Jones. On November the 8th of 2017, 31-year-old Texas man Lindo Jones was shot by a Mesquite police officer after being suspected of breaking into a car. The incident, which took place in a parking lot on Town East Boulevard, occurred after the officer in question responded to a 911 call about a car being broken into. When Officer Derek Wiley arrived at the scene, Jones was struggling to turn his truck alarm off. 35-year-old Wiley told Jones to get out of the vehicle. A struggle ensued between the two, which eventually led to Jones being shot twice. The man was then taken to a hospital. Police found out that the vehicle was in fact owned by Jones, but still charged him with evading arrest. After an internal investigation was launched, the Mesquite Police Department dropped the charge 6 days later. When the investigation concluded, it was determined that Officer Wiley had violated department policy, and he was consequently fired. He was also charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon by a public servant after a Dallas County grand jury reviewed the case. Wiley turned himself in and posted a $300,000 bond on December the 6th. 9 months later, The jury tasked with deciding the former officer's fate failed to reach a unanimous decision. A second trial culminated in Wiley being found not guilty on July the 22nd of 2019. Number 4. Florida neighbor. A Florida man and his teen son fired their .45 caliber pistols at a woman after mistakenly thinking she wanted to rob their Cypress Gardens home on October the 15th of 2022. The incident reportedly originated from a mail delivery mix-up. A package of medicine meant for 73-year-old Gino Colon Acosta was accidentally delivered to his neighbor's apartment. When the neighbor noticed the package, he dropped it off at Gino's apartment shortly after 7 a.m. Gino and his son, Rocky, saw the man on their Ring doorbell camera and found him suspicious. With a gun in tow, Rocky went outside to look around, but by that time the neighbor had already left. Gino subsequently followed his son outside to help him search for the purported burglar. They spotted a car with tinted windows and the engine running approximately 100 yards from their home. Gino pointed his gun at the vehicle, demanding the occupant step outside. Thinking that she was being carjacked, the woman frantically put her car in reverse, causing her to crash into another vehicle. Meanwhile, Rocky fired a total of 5 shots at her. As the woman was driving away, Gino opened fire at the vehicle as well. The Colon Acostas then contacted law enforcement but were later arrested after the woman, who was uninjured, told investigators what transpired. Among other criminal counts, the pair were facing attempted murder charges. The Polk County Sheriff said in a press conference that he wanted to see the father and son behind bars, adding that they were way out of line. Number 3. Deborah Kelly. In the early morning hours of October the 10th of 2015, Texas woman Deborah Kelly was fatally shot inside her San Antonio home. The 48-year-old's husband, Lars Itzo, woke up shortly before 4 a.m. after he reportedly heard his dog growling at something. He grabbed his 20-gauge sawn-off shotgun before heading out onto the landing. After spotting a dark figure concealed in shadow, 48-year-old Itzo fired the weapon, and the suspected intruder collapsed to the floor. As he struggled to reload the shotgun, Itzo hurried back to the bedroom to retrieve a different gun. He then heard the sound of a woman moaning and realized that his wife wasn't in bed. She was out on the landing, suffering from a gunshot wound to the chest. Itzo called 911 and explained the tragic mistake he'd made while waiting for paramedics to arrive. The operator talked him through CPR and unplugging the victim's wound. Upon the arrival of emergency crews, Kelly couldn't be revived and was pronounced dead at the scene. Itzo was interviewed by police, who found inconsistencies in his statements. He didn't have blood on his hands when paramedics arrived, despite claiming to have performed CPR on his dying wife. He was arrested on October the 21st before being released on a $75,000 bond. Itzo was ultimately found guilty of manslaughter in December 2015 and was consequently sentenced to 15 years in prison and fined $10,000. Number 2. El Haj Bullock. 21-year-old El Haj Bullock was shot while on his way back to his rental property in San Jose, California on October the 2nd of 2022. The young man was staying at an Airbnb across the street from a home belonging to Mark Henry Waters. As Bullock was returning to the property after going to the store, 67-year-old Waters exited his house and approached the young man with a gun that was later described as a Glock 22 semi-automatic handgun. Allegedly believing that Bullock was a burglar, Waters opened fire, leaving the renter with a broken femur. The victim was taken to a local hospital where he underwent emergency surgery. Waters was arrested at the scene, but posted a pre-arraignment bail of $100,000. The following month, he was formally charged with felony assault with a firearm, resulting in great bodily injury and involving the personal use of a firearm in connection with the shooting. Waters was later remanded into custody on a no-bail hold and pleaded not guilty on December the 12th. As of the latest updates, authorities continue to investigate possible hate crime allegations, but prosecutors hadn't filed any additional charges or enhancements. Waters' no-bail hold was upheld by the judge, who said that the man's actions posed a public safety concern on every conceivable level. Number 1. Nadeja Jemainekwa Presley. Authorities in South Carolina criminally charged a Greenville man who killed his own 23-year-old daughter, Nadeja Jemainekwa Presley, whom he mistook for an intruder. Nadejah was bringing food to her father, Jermaine Presley, at around 1:15 a.m. on May the 19th of 2019. The 43-year-old man heard someone trying to enter his Young Street residence through the front door and subsequently fired multiple shots. The gunfire severely wounded Nadejah and she ultimately died at the scene. Responding officers found heroin and cocaine inside the home and arrested Jermaine on drug and weapons charges the next day. After further investigation, his charges were later amended to include murder, possession of a weapon during a violent crime, and 3 counts of being a felon in possession of a firearm. At a hearing held in Greenville County Court, family members said they believe the shooting was an accident. As Jermaine's cousin took the stand and gave her statement, the man was seen shaking and sobbing. On June the 14th, his bond was set at $50,000 and was ordered to wear a GPS monitoring device if he bonded out. According to the state's inmate database, Jermaine was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years of incarceration. Between November of 2018 and August of 2019, prison officer Lucy Thornton developed what she described as mutual feelings for inmate Aaron Whitaker while working at HMP Alt Course in Merseyside, England. Simultaneously, she also had an inappropriate relationship with his brother, Hayden. The latter was in prison for wounding and burglary, while his brother, held at the same facility, was doing time for wounding. There was evidence that Thornton and the Whitakers had exchanged hundreds of messages. A piece of paper with the name Lucy and the phone number linked to Thornton was found in Aaron's cell. Subsequent searches by corrections officers recovered mini mobile phones from each brother's cell. In a phone confiscated from Thornton's home, she had Aaron's number under the contact name My Baby. Evidence indicated that the woman had also transferred £200 into an account to reportedly settle a drug debt for him. Following her arrest, Thornton admitted that she had feelings for Aaron and that she'd also been in contact with Hayden, whom she referred to as a friend, as well as with the brother's mother. There was no evidence that things had gotten physical within prison walls, but Aaron and Thornton became intimate after he was paroled in November of 2019. The following August, she gave birth to their son, but the relationship eventually came to an end. In June of 2021, Thornton was jailed for 10 months after she admitted 2 counts of misconduct in a public office. The sentencing judge described the ruling as a deterrent for other prison officers that might be tempted to betray the trust placed in them. Number 8. Aisha Gunn. While working as a prison officer at Berwyn Prison in Wrexham, Wales, Aisha Gunn fell for inmate Khurram Razak, a man serving a 12-year term for conspiracy to rob. Their tryst lasted from July to November of 2018. Gunn's colleagues became suspicious after noticing that she was spending extended periods of time in Razak's cell, and officials began investigating the possibility of a relationship. It emerged that Gunn, a criminology and psychology graduate, and the inmate had made more than 1,000 phone calls to each other. The couple, who were both in their late 20s at the time, shared explicit photos and videos, in addition to streaming lewd live footage of themselves. Gunn had also smuggled a pair of her underwear for Razak. Investigators found that the woman's bedroom was decorated with pictures of the pair kissing and hugging, some of which had been taken in Razak's cell. During questioning, Gunn admitted that she was in love with the inmate, claiming she'd fallen victim to compliments. She pleaded guilty to misconduct in public office and was jailed for a year in 2019. Razak was dealt with separately and given an 8-month sentence after he pleaded guilty to possessing a smartwatch and a mobile phone while incarcerated. Number 7. Rachel Martin. While employed as a prison guard at HMP Guy's Marsh in Dorset, England, 25-year-old Rachel Martin became involved with inmate Raymond Abraham, who was at the time in his early 40s. The relationship was believed to have unfolded from November the 1st of 2020 until March the 8th of the following year. It involved them exchanging hundreds of messages, many of them explicit in nature. Martin also received thousands of pounds from Abraham, a significant portion of which she spent on clothes, and reportedly boasted to a friend, "Ray is paying all my bills for as long as I need." The illicit affair was discovered after Martin was subjected to a random search on February the 3rd of 2021, whereupon a remote control adult toy was found in her jacket pocket. A few days later, a search of Abraham's cell produced a mobile phone, 2 USB sticks, and an SD card which had photos on it of Martin in various states of undress. Corrections officers also found women's underwear in Abraham's cell, which had reportedly been supplied by Martin. The latter pleaded guilty to 9 counts of misconduct related to her relationship with the inmate, and in February of 2023 was sentenced to 16 months in prison. Number 6. Bobby Parker. In 1994, Randy Parker was working as a deputy warden at the Oklahoma State Reformatory in Granite and living in a house on the prison property along with his wife Bobby and their 2 daughters. Randolph Franklin Dial was an inmate serving a life sentence for the 1981 murder of a karate instructor. He'd confessed to it and claimed it had been a contract killing for the mafia. An artist and sculptor, Dial convinced officials to allow him to begin an art program aimed at raising money for inmates' rehabilitation. He'd already been granted special privileges that enabled him to live in conditions of minimum security outside the prison walls. He set up a kiln in the Parker's garage, which became a pottery studio. Bobby Parker volunteered to assist Dial, and they would spend a lot of time alone in the workshop. As indicated by another inmate's testimony, on August 30th of 1994, Parker got into her family van with Dial and drove away from the prison. A search for them was launched, but only the vehicle was found abandoned in Wichita Falls, Texas. Parker, who was in her early 30s, and Dial would remain missing for over 10 years. On April the 4th of 2005, a tip from America's Most Wanted led law enforcement to storm a rural chicken farm in Kamptee, Texas, near the Louisiana border. They found Parker and Dial living together under assumed identities as Richard and Samantha Deal. The fugitive was arrested without incident. He subsequently claimed to have kidnapped the woman at knife point in the spring of 1994 and then manipulated her into staying with him for years as they traveled through different towns and cities in Texas. Parker was reunited with her husband. Under questioning, both she and Dial maintained the version of events in which she was his hostage until his death in 2007. However, evidence in the form of photos, emails, handwritten letters, and contraceptive devices found in their Texas trailer seemed to indicate that they'd been a willing couple. It was suspected that Parker had helped Dial escape after falling in love with him. In 2008, she was arrested and charged for her role in his jailbreak. Her defense maintained that she'd been a kidnapping victim controlled by Dial, who was described as a sick sociopathic egomaniac. It was argued that he'd used drugs, alcohol, threats, and abuse to force Parker into submission. After going through 3 months of deliberations, the testimonies of dozens of witnesses, and hundreds of pieces of evidence, the jury found Parker guilty of assisting the escape. She received a 1-year sentence but remained married to Randy, who testified that he still loved her. Number 5. Rachel Dollard. In February of 2022, Rachel Dollard was visiting inmate Joshua Brown at the Turney Center Industrial Complex Prison in Only, Tennessee. The latter had been convicted of drug charges and was serving an 11-year sentence. As 33-year-old Dollard kissed Brown during the visitation, she passed him a balloon containing ½ an ounce of methamphetamine. A short while later, the inmate fell violently ill and was rushed to the hospital where he passed away. The balloon had ruptured and his system had been flooded with a lethal amount of meth. In the aftermath of what the media dubbed the kiss of death, Dollard was arrested on charges of second-degree murder and introduction of contraband into a penal facility. Number 4. Toby Young. In 2005, Toby Young was running the Safe Harbor Dog program at Kansas's Lansing Correctional Facility. Young, at the time in her late 40s, led the program which paired rescued dogs with inmates to prepare them for adoption. While working in the prison, she was approached by prisoner John Mannard, who told her, "I'd like to be your next handler." The 27-year-old was serving a life sentence for his role in a fatal carjacking that had taken place in 1996 when he was in his teens. Young was married at the time, but as she continued working alongside Mannard for nearly a year, she fell in love with him and agreed to help him escape. In February of 2006, Manard hid inside a dog crate and she smuggled him in her car out of the maximum security prison. They spent 12 days on the run, a period that Young would look back upon and describe as wonder-filled. U.S. Marshals ultimately tracked them down to Tennessee and took them into custody. In the escape's wake, Manard had 10 years added to his sentence, while Young spent 27 months in prison for her role. Her husband divorced her while she was incarcerated. Years later, in a 2022 essay for Today, Young described the entire incident as helping her understand that she'd been profoundly dissatisfied with her life before meeting Manard, concluding that freedom is a state of mind, not a circumstance. Number 3. Jennifer Gavin. Between April and July of 2020, Welsh prison officer Jennifer Gavin entered into an inappropriate relationship with prisoner Alex Coxon at HMP Berwyn in Wrexham. She had accepted a bribe of £150 to bring a phone into the prison for Coxon, which the man used to continue communicating with her. At the time, Coxon had convictions involving drugs, robbery, and attempted robbery. Prison officials received information regarding the relationship and launched an investigation that resulted in them finding a cell phone hidden under a prison laptop in 23-year-old Coxon's cell. The phone was found to contain explicit photos and videos of a woman, subsequently identified as Gavin. It was revealed that the woman, at the time in her mid-20s, had expressed her love for the inmate and had kissed him after arranging to be alone with him. She was arrested, and during her trial, her defense argued that she'd been manipulated by Coxon into believing she was in a relationship with him and that she exhibited immaturity and an element of naivety. Gavin was ultimately jailed for 8 months following her guilty plea to the charge of misconduct. Number 2. Stephanie Smith-White. In 2018, Liverpool-born gangster Curtis "Cocky" Warren was housed at the maximum security HMP Frankland near Durham, England. An international drug trafficker who'd built an empire worth several £100 million. He was described as a major league offender and considered to be highly dangerous to the public. At the time, he was serving 13 years for conspiracy to import drugs, as well as a 10-year sentence for failing to pay back £198 million in proceeds of crime. The man, who was in his mid-50s, had previously killed an inmate in Holland during a jail fight. While behind bars at Frankland, Warren began a relationship with prison officer Stephanie Smith-White. Lasting from June to December of 2018, they became intimate in his cell, in a laundry room, and in a kitchen at the detainment facility. In order for them to have relations discreetly, Smith-White had reportedly cut a hole in the trousers of her prison uniform. She became so infatuated with Warren that she tattooed his name, Curtis, on her body next to a rose. A surveillance operation was mounted after staff had become suspicious. Smith-White was seen passing a note to the inmate and receiving one back. Warren reportedly tried to eat the note when it was intercepted by staff. The messages were explicit in nature, but Smith-White denied having had a physical relationship with Warren. Further searches of her home and the address of a relative produced the inmate's autobiography called Cocky: The Rise and Fall of Curtis Warren, as well as more explicit notes and letters. In Smith-White's car, the police found a phone that was only used to call one number, traced to Franklin Prison and determined to have been used by Warren. She was also found in possession of a Zanko prison phone, but denied that she'd intended to smuggle it for her lover. Smith-White eventually admitted that she and the gangster had been physically and romantically involved. She was jailed for 2 years after pleading guilty to misconduct and failing to report that Warren was in possession of a phone which had enabled him to continue running his drug empire from behind bars. Number 1. Vicky White. In the spring of 2023, Casey Cole White pleaded guilty to charges related to his escape from Alabama's Lauderdale County Jail, which had occurred the previous year. On April the 29th of 2022, corrections officer Vicky White, of no relation to Casey, walked out with him for a routine health inspection. At the time, the inmate was only weeks away from being trialed for the 2015 stabbing death of Connie Ridgway in Rogersville. He'd initially confessed to killing the woman, but later pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. After leaving the jail, he and 56-year-old Vicky disappeared. It would emerge that they'd been involved in a romantic relationship since 2020, and had successfully kept it a secret. Vicky had recently sold her house and was reportedly hoping to start a new life with Casey. The couple became the focus of an 11-day manhunt until they were eventually tracked down to a motel in Evansville, Indiana. Casey led law enforcement on a pursuit that ended with members of the fugitive task force ramming the couple's Cadillac, causing it to roll over into a ditch. Casey was arrested while Vicky was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head. In the aftermath, Casey was charged with felony murder for Vicky's death. Although he hadn't shot the woman, whom he referred to as his wife, she died during his jailbreak. The man eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree escape in order for the murder charge to be dropped. Thanks for watching.